Imagine inheriting a country that no longer belongs to you. The temples are still standing. The Nile still floods each year and retreats and leaves behind its dark, fertile soil. The pyramids at Giza still rise against the desert sky exactly as they have for more than 2,000 years. Everything looks like Egypt. Everything smells like Egypt. The priests still speak the ancient language, and the scribes still carve the old signs into stone. But the man sitting on the throne of the pharaohs is not Egyptian. He has never been Egyptian. He is a soldier king from a foreign dynasty, and his people have controlled the Nile Valley for nearly a century. Long enough that most people alive cannot remember a time when things were different. This is the Egypt that Psamtik inherited in 664 BC, according to current estimates. He was young. He was the son of a man who had tried to resist and failed. He had spent years in exile at the court of the very empire that occupied his homeland, the Assyrian Empire, the most fearsome military force the ancient world had yet produced. An empire that had already destroyed the kingdom of Israel, deported the populations of entire cities, and reduced kings to public spectacles of humiliation. Psamtik had watched all of this. He had learned from it, and when his moment came, he took it with a patience and a strategic intelligence that even his enemies would later be forced to acknowledge. Within 14 years of taking power, he had reunified Egypt for the first time in more than a century. Within 20 years, he had expelled the last Assyrian garrison. Within a generation, he had restored the most ancient civilization on earth to something approaching its former sovereignty. Not through a single great battle, not through a dramatic military victory that posterity could celebrate, but through a slow, careful, almost invisible campaign of maneuvering, alliance building, and political timing so precise that it left modern historians searching for words adequate to describe it. And here is the truly haunting part. Almost no one knows his name. Ask someone to list the famous pharaohs of Egypt. They will say Ramesses. They will say Tutankhamun. They might say Cleopatra, or Akhenaten, or Hatshepsut. In a room of 1,000 people, perhaps one or two might reach back far enough to say Psamtik, and even those who do will often struggle to say with confidence what he actually did. The man who pulled Egypt back from the edge of permanent foreign absorption, who launched one of the most remarkable political recoveries in the ancient world, who founded a dynasty that would endure for 138 years, and preside over a genuine cultural renaissance. This man has been swallowed almost completely by the long silence between ancient history and the stories we choose to tell. This is not an accident. It is the result of a gap in how we understand ancient history, a gap created partly by the fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence, partly by the way Greek and Roman writers later framed Egyptian history for their own purposes, and partly by something more troubling, the quiet erasure of an era that does not fit neatly into the narrative of Egyptian decline that textbooks prefer. Egypt is supposed to be a story of ancient glory, followed by a long, graceful fade. Psamtik's story complicates that narrative. It is a story of recovery, resilience, and hard-won independence achieved against odds that were, by any reasonable measure, impossible. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Psamtik I was, but what his story reveals about how civilizations survive, and why his 3,000-year silence matters more than we might think. The Egypt he was born into was not one country. It had not been one country for a very long time. For most of the century before his birth, the Nile Valley had been divided between competing powers. Libyan dynasties in the north, who had been ruling since the 11th century BC, Kushite pharaohs from the south, who had swept in and unified the country under their own control only to face the Assyrian hammer, and local rulers in the delta, who held their territories through a combination of loyalty to whoever was strongest and survival instincts honed across generations of political chaos. The word scholars use for this era is fragmentation. It is an accurate word, but it does not quite capture the human reality of what fragmentation means. A land where the person who controls the city to your north might be the enemy of the person who controls the city to your south, where the old certainties of central authority and unified culture have been replaced by a scramble for position in a hierarchy imposed from outside. Into this scramble, the Assyrian Empire had arrived like a geological force. Esarhaddon of Assyria had invaded Egypt in 671 BC and taken Memphis, the ancient capital, the city at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, the city whose name in the ancient Egyptian language meant enduring and beautiful. The taking of Memphis was not simply a military event, it was a symbolic rupture. Memphis was where the pharaohs had been crowned since the earliest dynasties. It was the seat of the god Ptah, the craftsman god who had shaped the world with his hands and his words. When Esarhaddon's armies marched into Memphis and the Kushite pharaoh Taharka fled south, something broke in the ancient order of the Nile Valley that had not broken in 3,000 years of civilization. Psamtik was a child when this happened. His father, Necho I, was a local ruler in the delta city of Sais who had allied with the Assyrians. A survival decision, not an ideological one. When Necho was later executed after being caught in a conspiracy against Assyrian authority, the young Psamtik was taken to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and educated at the imperial court. He learned Assyrian ways. He watched how the empire managed its territories. He came home again not as a prisoner, but as a recognized vassal, a man the Assyrians believed they could use. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand what Psamtik I accomplished, you need to understand what he was walking into. And to understand that, you need to understand what Egypt had been before the fragmentation began. Because without that context, the scale of the loss that preceded him and the scale of the recovery he engineered cannot be fully felt. Egypt's history, at the point Psamtik was born, was already ancient by a standard that makes the modern mind stagger. The first pharaohs had unified the Nile Valley around 3100 BC, according to current scholarly estimates. That means that by the time of Psamtik's birth in approximately 684 BC, Egypt had already been a recognizable, continuous civilization for roughly 2,400 years. To put that in perspective, we stand roughly 2,000 years from the height of the Roman Empire. Egypt's civilization, when Psamtik inherited it, was older relative to his time than Rome is to ours. This is not simply a number to absorb and move on from. This is the context within which every Egyptian, every priest, every scribe, every farmer, standing in the flood-softened earth along the Nile, understood their own existence. They were the inheritors of something so old, so layered with meaning and memory and sacred tradition, that the idea of foreign occupation was not merely a political insult, it was a theological wound. The pharaoh was not simply a king. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the son of Osiris, the intermediary between the human world and the divine order that kept the universe functioning. When a foreign power sat on that throne, or worse, when the throne was fragmented across a dozen competing local rulers, something in the cosmic order itself was understood to be broken. The rituals still happened, the temples still operated, but the center was empty. The empire that had filled that center most recently before the chaos, the New Kingdom, which ran from approximately 1650 to 1070 BC, had been one of the most powerful states in the ancient world. At its height under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II, Egypt controlled territory stretching from modern Sudan in the south to modern Syria and Lebanon in the north. The Nile Valley under New Kingdom rule was producing surplus grain that fed armies, sustained temples, and supported a bureaucratic apparatus of remarkable sophistication. Egyptian ships traded in the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian architects were perfecting stone construction techniques that would not be matched in Europe for another millennium. Egyptian doctors were writing medical texts that described surgical procedures with a clinical precision that modern physicians, reading them 3,000 years later, would find recognizable. And then the New Kingdom ended. It did not end with a single dramatic collapse, though the era of its ending, around 1200 BC, was catastrophic enough. The wider eastern Mediterranean world around that period experienced what scholars now call the Bronze Age collapse. one of the most sweeping systemic civilizational failures in recorded human history. The great palace civilizations of the Aegean, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, vanished. The Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's great rival and treaty partner, disappeared so completely that it would not be rediscovered until European archaeologists began working in Turkey in the 19th century of the modern era. Major trading cities were burned and never rebuilt. The international exchange networks that had connected the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries simply stopped functioning. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but only just, and it emerged diminished. The New Kingdom's final century was marked by declining royal authority, increasingly powerful priesthoods, military commanders who controlled their own territories, and a succession of weak pharaohs unable to hold the center. By around 1070 BC, the kingdom had fractured into two halves, the north ruled by pharaohs based in the delta, the south effectively governed by the high priests of Amun at Thebes. This is the period Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period, and it would last, with variations and interruptions, for more than 400 years. 400 years of fragmentation. 400 years in which the memory of unified Egypt persisted. In temple inscriptions, in royal titles that pharaohs continued to use even when their actual territory was barely a city and its surroundings, in the deliberate copying and preservation of old texts and artistic styles. But the reality of it had long since dissolved. New powers moved into the vacuum. The Libyans came first. Beginning around 945 BC, a dynasty of Libyan origin, the 22nd dynasty, established itself in the delta and ruled as pharaohs, adopting Egyptian names and Egyptian religious practices with the pragmatic flexibility of conquerors who understood that legitimacy in Egypt required becoming Egyptian. They were followed by the 23rd and 24th dynasties, the boundaries between which are, in the honest assessment of modern Egyptology, somewhat blurry. The country was effectively divided between Libyan rulers in the delta cities of Bubastis, Tanis, and Sais, and the powerful priesthood of Amun at Thebes, who wielded religious authority that political leaders ignored at their peril. Into this fragmented landscape came the Kushites. Kush, the kingdom centered around the Fourth Nile Cataract in modern Sudan, had been part of Egypt's world for most of the second millennium BC. The new kingdom had conquered Kush and administered it as a province for nearly 500 years, installing a viceroy of Kush, building temples to Egyptian gods, and extracting the gold and cattle and exotic goods of sub-Saharan Africa that fed the new kingdom's wealth. But as Egypt weakened, Kush reasserted its independence. And as the Kushite kingdom grew in the late 2nd millennium and early 1st millennium BC, it was shaped profoundly by the Egyptian culture it had absorbed, so profoundly that by the time the Kushite kings turned their attention north, they did not think of themselves as conquerors of Egypt. They thought of themselves as restorers of it. The Kushite king Pie, sometimes written Pianki, marched north into Egypt around 732 BC. His victory stele, discovered at Gebel Barkal in modern Sudan, and now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world. It does not read like a conqueror's boast. It reads like a disappointed father describing the misbehavior of wayward children. Pie was appalled by the Libyan rulers who had allowed Egyptian religious life to decay. He was outraged by cities that had failed to maintain their temples. He demanded not tribute but piety, a restoration of proper ritual, proper reverence for the gods, proper ordering of the sacred world that Egypt was supposed to embody. The great Egyptologist James Henry Bristed, writing in the early 20th century, called Pie's campaign one of the most remarkable documents of the ancient world. And this is a man who spent his career surrounded by remarkable documents. What struck Bristed was the tone, the absolute conviction of a man who believed he was not doing violence to a civilization, but rescuing it from itself, whether one agrees with that framing or not. And there are obvious complications in a conqueror describing conquest as restoration. The text is a window into a world of breathtaking complexity, where the lines between foreign and native, between invader and defender, were far more tangled than any simple narrative can accommodate. Pie's successors, Shabaka, Shabitku, and then Taharqa consolidated Kushite rule over Egypt as the 25th dynasty and presided over a period of genuine cultural revival. Taharqa in particular undertook a massive building program at Karnak, restored temples across Egypt, and attempted to project Egyptian power back into the Levant, the eastern coastal region that had traditionally been within Egypt's sphere of influence. For a time, it looked as though the Kushites might achieve what Egypt had been unable to achieve on its own. A reunification strong enough to resist the pressure coming from the east. But from the east came something that even the Kushite pharaohs could not withstand. From the east came Assyria. The Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC was, in terms of sheer military effectiveness, without parallel in the ancient world. Modern scholars studying the Assyrian war machine have described it as the first genuinely professional army in human history. Not a seasonal levy of farmers obligated to fight for their king, but a standing force of trained soldiers with specialized units, siege engineers, cavalry, and a logistical apparatus capable of sustaining campaigns across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain. The Assyrians had spent 3 centuries refining the art of conquest, and they had learned, brutally, that terror was a strategic weapon, as important as any physical armament. Their practice of deporting conquered populations, removing entire ethnic groups from their homelands and resettling them in distant parts of the empire, was designed not simply to punish resistance, but to destroy the social memory that made resistance possible. You cannot organize a revolt around the defense of your homeland if your homeland has been emptied and refilled with strangers. When Esarhaddon of Assyria looked west and saw Egypt, rich, religiously significant, the most ancient of the great civilizations, he did not see an unconquerable fortress, he saw a prize. His first invasion in 674 BC failed. Taharqa's forces stopped the Assyrians, and for a brief, bright moment it seemed that Egypt might hold. But in 671 BC, Esarhaddon came back with a larger force and a more careful plan. He crossed the Sinai, fought his way across the delta, and took Memphis in a campaign that the Assyrian royal annals describe with the unsettling pride of an administration that has learned to treat large-scale destruction as a bureaucratic process. Taharqa fled south. His family was captured. Egypt, for the first time in its 3,000-year history, was a province of a foreign empire that made no pretense of becoming Egyptian. The local rulers of the delta, men like Necho I of Sais, Psamtik's father, became Assyrian vassals. This was a pragmatic arrangement for both sides. The Assyrians wanted a stable Egypt that would produce tax revenue and grain without requiring a permanent large garrison. The local rulers wanted to survive and maintain their positions. The arrangement worked, after a fashion, as long as everyone played their role. Necho I did not play his role for long enough. Caught in a conspiracy, almost certainly connected to attempts to restore some degree of independence or to negotiate with Taharqa's successor, the historical record is frustratingly incomplete here. He was executed by the Assyrians. His son Psamtik, probably in his early or mid-teens at the time, was taken to Nineveh. Here is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, and where any honest historian has to acknowledge both what the evidence tells us and what it does not. The years Psamtik spent at the Assyrian court are almost entirely lost to us. We do not know what he studied, though the education offered to foreign hostages and vassal children at Nineveh was by ancient standards comprehensive. Languages, court protocol, military administration, the workings of empire. We do not know whom he befriended or what he observed. What we know is what he did when he came back. He came back as a recognized vassal prince. He came back with Assyrian legitimacy, a crucial piece of political currency in a world where Assyria was the dominant power. And he came back, it would appear from everything that followed, with an extremely clear understanding of exactly how Assyrian power operated, where it was strong, and, crucially, where it was overextended. Because the Assyrian Empire, for all its terrifying effectiveness, was managing an enormous amount of territory with an inherently limited human capacity. It was fighting in multiple directions simultaneously, against Babylon in the south, against Elam in the east, against the Cimmerians and Scythians in the north, against restive populations across the Levant. Egypt was important, but it was also far from the imperial heartland. The garrisons stationed in the delta were real but not unlimited. The attention Assyria could devote to managing Egypt had structural limits, and a young man who had spent formative years inside the imperial machine would have understood those limits better than almost anyone. When the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal placed Psamtik in control of Sais as a loyal vassal around 664 BC, he almost certainly believed he was installing a compliant local administrator who would manage the Western Delta on behalf of the empire and cause no trouble. He was, in one of the more consequential miscalculations of ancient history, very wrong. The Egypt Psamtik received was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of local rulers. In the delta cities of Tanis, Bubastis, Mendes, Athribis, Leontopolis, and others, each of whom had made their own accommodations with Assyrian authority, and each of whom had their own ambitions, their own local networks, and their own reasons for caution. Some of these men were nominal allies, some were rivals. Some had been positioned by the Assyrians specifically as counterweights to each other, because an Egypt full of competing local rulers was an Egypt that could not effectively organize against Assyrian control. To reunify Egypt, Psamtik would have to outmaneuver all of them. He would have to do it without triggering an Assyrian military response that he lacked the forces to resist. He would have to find external support without making himself a client of a new foreign master. And he would have to do all of this while maintaining, at least on the surface, the appearance of an obedient vassal loyal to the king of Assyria. What followed was one of the most sophisticated political campaigns in the ancient world. To understand the tools available to Psamtik, it helps to understand the world he was operating in. The mid-7th century BC was a period of extraordinary civilizational density. While Psamtik was maneuvering in the delta, the Assyrian heartland in northern Mesopotamia was at the peak of its administrative sophistication. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, a deliberate project to collect and copy every significant text in the known world, was being assembled into what would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the modern era, a collection of thousands of clay tablets preserving Mesopotamian literature, science, history, and religious texts. In the Western Mediterranean, the Phoenician city-states were establishing colonies across the North African coast and into the Iberian Peninsula. In what is now Greece, the city-states were undergoing the transformations, political, intellectual, economic, that would produce the civilization that later became the foundation myth of Western thought. In Persia, the Median and Persian kingdoms were beginning the consolidation that would eventually produce the empire that would finish what Psamtik started, ending Assyrian dominance for good. The ancient world was not a series of isolated civilizations taking turns at greatness. It was an interconnected system, a web of trade routes, diplomatic marriages, refugee movements, mercenary contracts, and religious exchanges that linked the Nile Valley to the Levant to Mesopotamia, to the Aegean, to the steppes of Central Asia. Psamtik understood this web. He had been educated at its center, and the most important thread in that web, for his purposes, was a new military power that had been establishing itself on the western and southern shores of the Aegean. Lydia, the kingdom in western Anatolia, modern Turkey, whose king Gyges was looking for allies against Assyrian pressure from the east. The Lydians and the Egyptians had common cause. Both were dealing with a world in which Assyrian dominance was the central geopolitical fact. Gyges sent envoys to Ashurbanipal seeking alliance, but when that effort failed, the Assyrian king dismissed the Lydian king as a nobody beyond the edge of the known world. Gyges turned elsewhere. The ancient sources, particularly the account preserved by Herodotus, writing more than a century later, describe Gyges as sending forces to support Psamtik's campaign against the other Delta rulers. These forces were almost certainly Ionian and Carian Greek mercenaries, soldiers from the Greek-speaking populations of the Aegean coast of Anatolia, highly sought after in the 7th century BC for their discipline, their distinctive equipment, and their effectiveness in the kind of combined arms warfare that was transforming military practice across the Mediterranean world. The mercenaries were the key. Psamtik's own forces a delta principality with limited manpower and no standing professional army, comparable to what the Assyrians had deployed against Taharqa, were not sufficient to overcome the combined resistance of the other delta rulers. But Greek mercenaries fighting in the phalanx formation, with their bronze armor and long spears, represented a military technology that the delta rulers had never encountered in the way Psamtik could now deploy it. The combination of Psamtik's political legitimacy, he was, after all, the Assyrian-recognized ruler of Sais, his strategic intelligence, and the shock effect of unfamiliar mercenary forces proved decisive. There is an account in Herodotus, probably drawing on Egyptian priestly records that are now lost, of an oracle that shaped the early stages of Psamtik's campaign. The oracle, supposedly from the goddess Neith at Sais, told Psamtik to look for help from men of bronze coming from the sea. When Ionian Greek raiders, in their gleaming bronze armor, first landed on the Egyptian coast, local people sent word to Psamtik that the prophecy had been fulfilled. The story may be a later elaboration. Oracles have a remarkable tendency in ancient narratives to predict exactly what eventually happened, but its survival tells us something important about how Psamtik's court and Egyptian popular memory chose to frame the Greek mercenary alliance, not as a practical military arrangement, but as a divinely ordained instrument of Egyptian restoration. The foreigners were not invaders. They were tools that the gods had placed in Psamtik's hands. This framing mattered enormously, and Psamtik clearly understood why. Egypt was not simply a political entity. It was a theological one. Every action taken by or attributed to the pharaoh existed within a framework of cosmic meaning, of Mat, the Egyptian concept of right order, truth, and justice that the pharaoh was obligated to maintain against the forces of chaos. A pharaoh who used foreign mercenaries to reunify Egypt could be criticized as dependent on outsiders. A pharaoh who fulfilled a divine oracle by welcoming men of bronze from the sea was doing exactly what the gods had ordained. The theological packaging was not cynical. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, the political and the divine were not separate domains. Psamtik lived inside a cosmology where divine intervention in human affairs was not a metaphor but a literal operating principle, and his campaign for Egyptian independence was simultaneously a campaign for the restoration of divine order. The campaign itself, as best as the fragmentary sources allow us to reconstruct it, unfolded over approximately 9 years, from roughly 664 to 656 BC. The other Delta rulers were overcome one by one. The precise military and diplomatic details are largely lost. The records of individual battles, the terms of submission, the fates of rival rulers. What the Assyrian records show is that for most of this period, Psamtik continued to be described as an Assyrian vassal. He was not openly defying the empire. He was carefully, incrementally, extending his control over the Delta without doing anything that would require Assyria to treat him as an enemy rather than a client. This is the subtlety that makes Psamtik so extraordinary as a historical figure, and also so difficult to find in popular accounts of ancient history. He did not lead a dramatic uprising. He did not deliver a great speech and call Egypt to arms. He maneuvered, he calculated, he advanced where he could and held where he needed to, and he did it in a way that preserved, for as long as possible, the fiction that everything was in good order from Assyria's perspective. And he was helped, enormously, by the fact that Assyria had more pressing problems. By the early 650s BC, Ashurbanipal was fighting a catastrophic civil war against his own brother, Shamash-Shumukin, who governed Babylon and had raised a massive coalition against him. The conflict consumed Assyrian military and administrative resources on a scale that left the empire unable to respond effectively to developments in the far west. Egypt was not a priority when Babylon was in revolt. Psamtik's timing, whether by genius or fortune or some combination of both, aligned perfectly with the moment when the empire that had installed him was looking elsewhere. By 656 BC, the ancient sources, primarily a papyrus record known as the Nitocris Adoption Stele, discovered at Karnak, are now one of the most important documents for reconstructing this period, confirm that Psamtik controlled not just the Delta but Upper Egypt as well. The stele records the installation of his daughter Nitocris as the divine adoratrix of Amun at Thebes, the highest religious office in Upper Egypt, held by a woman connected to the ruling house and conferring enormous religious authority on Psamtik's dynasty. The installation of Nitocris was not a military act. It was a ritual act, a religious political transaction conducted through negotiation with the Theban priesthood. The previous holder of the office, a woman named Shepenwepet II, formally adopted Nitocris as her successor. The arrangement was captured in detailed legal text on the stele, specifying the properties and revenues that would support the new office holder. A leading scholar of late-period Egypt, Kenneth Kitchen, described this document as among the most important administrative texts of the entire first millennium BC. It is not a battle account. It is a contract, and that is exactly the point. Psamtik's reunification of Egypt was largely accomplished through contracts, rituals, strategic alliances, and patient political work, rather than through the spectacular military campaigns that ancient narrative history tends to prefer. The Nitocris adoption stele is a perfect emblem of how he operated. The power move disguised as a religious ceremony, the political consolidation expressed in the language of divine obligation. By around 650 BC, the Assyrian garrisons in the Delta, the last physical symbol of foreign occupation in Egypt, had withdrawn. Whether they were expelled by force, whether they left as part of a negotiated arrangement, or whether they simply departed as Assyrian attention shifted permanently elsewhere, is not entirely clear from the surviving evidence. What is clear is that they were gone, and with their departure, Egypt was, for the first time in nearly a century, under the control of an Egyptian ruler who was accountable to no foreign overlord. Psamtik I, son of the executed Necho, exile at the Assyrian court, vassal prince of Sais, stood at the beginning of what would become the 26th dynasty, the Sais dynasty, named for his home city, and looked out over a country that was once again, in the most fundamental sense, his own. What he chose to do with it next would shape Egypt for 138 years and leave a cultural legacy that echoes down to the present day. The discovery of the Nitocris adoption stele itself is a story worth pausing on because it illustrates something important about how our knowledge of this period has been assembled, and how recently much of it was assembled. The stele was found at Karnak in the mid-19th century of the modern era, during a period when European archaeologists and Egyptologists were descending on the major Egyptian sites with a combination of genuine scholarly passion and the imperial confidence that characterized their era. Karnak, the vast temple complex at ancient Thebes in Upper Egypt, the largest religious building complex ever constructed in human history, covering more than 2 square kilometers and accumulated across more than 2,000 years of pharaonic building, had been yielding inscriptions and artifacts to Western scholars for decades. The men who deciphered these texts were working with a language that had been unknown in the modern world for more than 1,000 years before the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone in the early 19th century. They were, in a very real sense, learning to hear voices that had been silent for millennia. When the Nitocris adoption stele was first translated and its content understood, the significance was immediately recognized. Here was a primary source document, not a later account, not a Greek or Roman summary, but an actual contemporary record, carved in stone in the reign of Psamtik himself, that confirmed the political reality of his reunification. The stele named names, it specified properties, it recorded the religious ceremony of adoption with the same legal precision that modern property transfer documents use. It was irrefutable evidence that by 656 BC, Psamtik's authority extended to the city that had been the religious heart of Egypt for more than 1,000 years. Scholars working on this period have noted with some wryness that the Nitocris stele is simultaneously one of the most important documents of the late period and one of the least known outside academic circles. The contrast with the Rosetta Stone, which became perhaps the most famous object in the history of Egyptology, is instructive. The Rosetta Stone is famous not for what it says, but for what it did. It unlocked the entire Egyptian hieroglyphic writing system. The Nitocrystale is known only to specialists, because what it says requires the context of a historical period that most people have never encountered. This is a recurring problem in the study of Psamtik and the Sais period. The evidence exists, and it is extraordinary, but it sits behind a wall of unfamiliarity that most popular history never manages to breach. This is what makes the silence around Psamtik so frustrating and so important to break open. By 650 BC, Psamtik I controlled Egypt. But controlling Egypt and restoring Egypt were two entirely different things. The country he had reunified was not simply politically fragmented. It was deeply, systemically damaged in ways that a military or diplomatic campaign alone could not repair. The temples had been maintained in the most important centers. The Egyptians were never negligent in temple upkeep in the way that later collapsed civilizations sometimes were. But the economic foundation of the state, the elaborate system of land ownership, taxation, agricultural management, and royal patronage that had sustained pharaonic civilization for millennia, had been disrupted by a century of competing authorities and foreign occupation. The scribal traditions that kept these systems functioning had survived, but they had fragmented along with the political authority they were supposed to serve. Different regions had developed different administrative practices. The coherent, centralized bureaucracy of the new kingdom was a memory, not a reality. And underneath all of this was a deeper problem, one that touched not just the administration of a state, but the identity of a people. Egypt, more than almost any other civilization in the ancient world, derived its self-understanding from continuity with the past. The pharaonic tradition was not simply a system of government. It was an argument about time, an argument that the world operated through patterns established at the moment of creation, that the proper ordering of human society was a reflection of the divine ordering of the cosmos, and that the pharaoh's primary obligation was to maintain this ordering against the constant pressure of chaos. This argument was made not in philosophical texts alone, but in art, in architecture, in ritual, in the very proportions of temples and the angles of hieroglyphic script. Egypt's visual and cultural language was, in the most literal sense, an argument about permanence. The third intermediate period had fractured this argument. 400 years of competing dynasties, Libyan Kushite local, had produced a situation where the royal traditions themselves had become contested. Different rulers in different cities maintained different versions of sacred chronology. The king lists, the ancient records that established the unbroken line of pharaonic authority stretching back to the mythological first kings, had been maintained by the temple scribes but were no longer synchronized across the country in a single authoritative version. There were now multiple versions of Egyptian sacred time, corresponding to the multiple power centers that had existed during the fragmentation. And beneath the royal traditions, at the level of ordinary religious practice, the mixing of Egyptian, Libyan, and Nubian cultural elements across 4 centuries had produced a religious landscape more complex and syncretic than the idealized unity that the pharaonic tradition claimed. Psamtik understood that political reunification was necessary but not sufficient. He needed a cultural restoration, and his strategy for achieving it was, in its way, as sophisticated as his strategy for achieving political reunification. The Sais period, the era of the 26th dynasty that Psamtik founded, is known to Egyptologists as one of the most deliberate and sustained archaizing movements in human cultural history. The word archaizing means the conscious and programmatic imitation of an older style, the deliberate reaching back to an earlier era as a source of cultural legitimacy. The Saita artists, scribes, and architects did not simply copy Old Kingdom styles because they found them beautiful. Though the Old Kingdom remains among the most visually compelling periods in the entire history of Egyptian art, they copied them because doing so was a political and theological statement. They were asserting that the 26th dynasty was not merely the latest in a long series of competing powers. They were asserting direct continuity with the deepest foundations of Egyptian civilization itself. The results were striking. Sais sculpture and relief carving reached a quality and technical refinement that astonished later Egyptologists, who encountered it expecting the decadence they assumed must accompany a late dynasty. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts holds a collection of Sais period bronzes, small figures of gods and sacred animals, whose craftsmanship is so precise and so beautiful that scholars studying them for the first time often express something approaching disbelief that objects of such quality were produced in what popular history insists on calling the decline of ancient Egypt. The heads of Sais period royal statues, when they survive, show faces of extraordinary subtlety, a delicacy of modelling, a psychological presence in the carved features that seems to carry the weight of 3,000 years of tradition without being crushed by it. This archiving project was not accidental. Psamtik and his successors were systematically sending artists to the great monuments of the Old Kingdom, to Saqqara, to Giza, to the ancient sites of the First and Second Dynasties, to study the originals, copy the proportions, learn the canons of representation that had been established in the 3rd millennium BC. They were conducting, in effect, a state-sponsored program of archaeological and artistic research directed toward a practical and urgent political goal, the re-establishment of an Egyptian identity so deeply rooted in the oldest traditions that no one could challenge its authenticity. At the same time, Psamtik was making other kinds of decisions that reveal the complexity of his situation and the pragmatism of his mind. The Greek mercenaries who had helped him reunify Egypt did not go home. Psamtik settled them at military colonies in the delta, the most famous of which was a site near the modern Egyptian city of Tel Dafena, known in antiquity as Daphne, or in the Egyptian language as Tapanhes. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt more than a century after Psamtik's death, described seeing the camps, areas where the mercenaries and their descendants had settled and maintained distinctly Greek cultural practices. These communities became permanent features of the delta landscape, and their presence reflects something important about Psamtik's political vision. He was not an isolationist. Despite the archaizing cultural program, despite the emphasis on Egyptian tradition and continuity, Psamtik was genuinely open to the outside world in a way that sharply distinguishes his dynasty from the fearful inward turning that sometimes characterizes later phases of Egyptian history. He actively cultivated trade with the Greek world, establishing the city of Naucratis, or possibly expanding an existing trading post into a fully functioning Greek emporium in the western delta. Naucratis became one of the most remarkable cultural meeting points of the ancient Mediterranean, a city where Greek merchants, artisans, and intellectuals lived and worked under Egyptian royal patronage, trading not just goods but ideas. Egyptian priests explained the mysteries of their 3,000-year-old civilization to curious Greek visitors. Greek thinkers absorbed what they heard and carried it back across the Mediterranean, where it would eventually surface in the philosophical traditions that later cultures would identify as the foundation of Western rationalism. The irony, and it is a genuine irony that serious scholars have noted, is that the Egyptian cultural legacy that most profoundly shaped the Greek world reached Greece largely through the Sais period, through the open, cosmopolitan, outward-looking dynasty that Psamtik founded. The popular imagination connects ancient Egypt to the Old Kingdom pyramids, to Ramesses II's colossal statues, to the New Kingdom temples at Luxor. But the Egypt that Herodotus actually visited, the Egypt that Solon the Athenian statesman reportedly learned from, the Egypt that influenced the mathematics and geometry that Greeks would later systematize, that Egypt was Site Egypt, Psamtik's Egypt. But here's the problem, and it gets worse. Even as Psamtik was building this sophisticated, cosmopolitan, culturally rich kingdom, the forces that would eventually destroy it were already moving. The Assyrian Empire that had dominated the ancient Near East for nearly 3 centuries was showing the first signs of what would become a catastrophic collapse. And here is the devastating paradox of Psamtik's position. The collapse of Assyria, which removed the most immediate threat to Egyptian independence, also removed the stabilizing force that had, for all its brutality, imposed a kind of order on the Levant and Mesopotamia. When Assyria fell, it created a power vacuum of enormous proportions, and into that vacuum poured forces that would eventually prove as dangerous to Egypt as Assyria had been. The immediate beneficiary of Assyrian decline was not Egypt. It was a coalition of Medes and Babylonians who systematically destroyed the Assyrian heartland in the 620s and 610s BC, culminating in the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. That is, just over 50 years after Psamtik's reunification of Egypt. The great library that Ashurbanipal had assembled, the one that would not be rediscovered until the 19th century of the modern era, when archaeologists excavating the mounds at Nineveh found thousands of clay tablets buried in the ruins, was destroyed and buried when the city fell. 3 centuries of Assyrian administrative records, literary works, scientific knowledge, and historical accounts were consumed in the fire and subsequently sealed under the debris. The most powerful empire the ancient world had yet seen ended in a single generation. Psamtik was dead by then. He died in 610 BC, after a reign of 54 years, and his son Necho II had already taken the throne. But the late years of Psamtik's reign were shaped by the awareness of what was happening in the East. He made a decision that remains controversial among scholars. He chose to send Egyptian forces to support Assyria against the Babylonian-Median coalition. This seems counterintuitive. Why would the man who had spent his career expelling Assyrian influence from Egypt now send Egyptian soldiers to prop up the Assyrian state? The answer, almost certainly, was geopolitical calculation rather than sentiment. A weakened Assyria served Egyptian interests better than a powerful Babylon. The Babylonians were an unknown quantity, potentially more aggressive, and positioned closer to the Levant, through which any Eastern power would have to pass to threaten Egypt. The gamble failed. Assyria fell anyway, and Egypt's intervention in the Levant continued under Necho II at the famous Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC, where Necho killed the Judean king Josiah, an event recorded in both the Hebrew Bible and the Babylonian Chronicle, ultimately could not arrest the realignment of power in the ancient Near East. The Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, would eventually push Egyptian influence out of the Levant entirely. But in the moment, from Psamtik's perspective, it was a rational strategic response to an enormously complex regional situation. And throughout all of this, the political maneuvering, the cultural archaizing program, the mercenary settlements, the Levantine interventions, something else was happening in Egypt that deserves careful attention because it is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the Sais period and one of the most important for understanding what the 26th dynasty actually was. Psamtik opened Egypt's administrative and religious institutions to a far greater degree of local elite participation than had been possible during the periods of foreign domination. The great temple priesthoods at Memphis, at Thebes, at Heliopolis, at Sais were staffed and managed by Egyptian families of ancient lineage who had maintained their position through the Third Intermediate Period with varying degrees of compromise and collaboration with successive foreign rulers. Under Psamtik, these families were systematically elevated, their religious authority confirmed, their economic privileges restored, and in many cases expanded. The priests of Ptah at Memphis, whose position as custodians of the ancient craft traditions was among the most prestigious in Egypt, received particular attention. The archival records from the Memphite temple complex, imperfectly preserved but enough to give a sense of the period, show a systematic reinvestment in the institutional infrastructure of Egyptian religious life. This was not simply generosity or piety, it was politics. The great temple establishments were not just religious institutions. They were economic actors of enormous scale, controlling land, labor, manufacturing, and trade across entire regions. The priesthoods were, in effect, the administrative backbone of the Egyptian state, the institutional memory, the archival system, the educational network, and the social welfare infrastructure all at once. By winning the loyalty of the priesthoods, Psamtik was rebuilding the state itself from the inside. He was reconnecting the political authority of the crown to the institutional networks that had actually sustained Egyptian civilization through 4 centuries of fragmentation. It was, in its way, a recognition of something profound, that the civilization had survived not because of its pharaohs, The pharaohs had come and gone, Egyptian and Libyan and Cushite and Assyrian, but because of the institutions that the pharaohs had always depended on. The temples had kept the language alive. The priests had kept the rituals functioning. The scribes had kept copying the ancient texts. The craftsmen had kept building in the old styles. While the political authority of the state had fragmented, the institutional substrate of the civilization had continued. Psamtik did not recreate Egyptian civilization. He rebuilt its political roof on foundations that had never completely crumbled. But here is what makes this truly terrifying, or rather, truly sobering, when you step back and look at the full picture. Psamtik's achievement was real and remarkable, and the cultural renaissance of the Sais period was genuine. But the very conditions that made his achievement possible, the cosmopolitan openness, the Greek mercenaries, the trade with the Aegean world, the tolerance for foreign communities in the Delta, were also planting the seeds of a transformation that would eventually dissolve the distinctiveness of what he was trying to preserve. Every Greek merchant who settled in Naucratis, every Ionian soldier whose children grew up speaking Egyptian, every Carian mercenary whose grandchildren built their graves in Egyptian style, each of these individuals was part of a cultural mixing that was changing Egypt even as the archaizing program tried to anchor it to its ancient identity. The Egypt that Psamtik restored was not the same Egypt that had existed before. It could not be. The memory was intact. The ritual forms were intact. The architectural vocabulary was intact. But the human fabric of the Nile Valley in the 7th and 6th centuries BC was more diverse, more connected to the wider Mediterranean world, and more permeable to outside influences than it had been during the New Kingdom's height. Psamtik navigated this reality with extraordinary skill. His successors did too, for 5 generations. But the navigation was always against a current that only grew stronger as the 6th century progressed, and the Greek world, the Babylonian world, and eventually the Persian world exerted increasing gravitational pull on every state in the region. The silence that follows Psamtik in popular history is, in this sense, a silence about a larger truth, that the recovery of a civilization is never simply a restoration. It is always also a transformation. What Psamtik built was Egypt, genuinely, authentically, deeply Egypt in its values and its aspirations. But it was Egypt in a new world, and the new world was already pressing in from every direction. To fully appreciate the magnitude of what Psamtik was attempting, it is worth dwelling on exactly what Egyptian civilization meant in the ancient world, not as a romantic abstraction, but as a concrete, functioning system of organized human life. At its administrative core, Egypt was one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic states that had ever existed. The country's geography, a narrow strip of arable land along the Nile, surrounded by desert, created both the necessity and the possibility of centralized management in a way that no other ancient landscape quite replicated. The annual Nile flood was the foundation of everything. Every year the river rose, spread over its banks, deposited the rich black silt that made the Egyptian soil among the most fertile on earth, and then receded. The timing and extent of the flood determined whether the harvest would be sufficient, deficient, or catastrophic. Managing the distribution of water, the timing of planting, the storage of surplus grain against the years of low flood, and the equitable allocation of irrigated land required exactly the kind of centralized record-keeping and enforcement capacity that the pharaonic state had developed over 3,000 years. The scribal system that maintained these records was extraordinary. Egyptian scribes were trained in specialized schools, attached to the great temples and the royal palace, learning not only the hieroglyphic script used for monumental inscriptions, but also the cursive hieratic script used for administrative documents, and the even more abbreviated demotic script that was already developing in the late 3rd Intermediate period, and would become the primary everyday writing system of the Sais era. They recorded harvests, tax receipts, land surveys, census data, legal transactions, medical treatments, military accounts, and religious protocols, all in a system of meticulous documentation that was, by ancient standards, remarkably systematic. The survival of papyrus documents from this period, imperfect, fragmentary, dependent on the accident of being buried in dry contexts, away from the Nile's annual flooding, has allowed modern Egyptologists to reconstruct at least the outlines of how this system functioned. The picture that emerges is of a civilization that was genuinely sophisticated in its management of human and natural resources, one that understood the importance of standardization, record-keeping, and institutional continuity in a way that many later and more celebrated empires did not. Psamtik's restoration of this system was therefore not simply a political act. It was the reconstruction of a complex operational infrastructure that had been damaged in different ways in different parts of the country across 4 centuries. He was not rebuilding a government. He was rebuilding the machinery that a government needs to actually function. The trained personnel, the institutional relationships, the physical infrastructure of granaries and canals and administrative centres, and the legal framework within which all of this operated. The economic dimensions of this restoration are particularly striking when examined carefully. The Sais period saw a significant expansion of Egypt's commercial connections with the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. This was partly a deliberate policy. Psamtik and his successors actively encouraged foreign merchants to settle and trade, and partly a consequence of larger regional developments, particularly the expansion of Greek colonization and trade networks across the Mediterranean basin that was transforming the economic geography of the ancient world in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. Egyptian exports during this period included grain, Egypt's perennial advantage, the annual gift of the Nile flood that made the country the grain basket of the ancient world, as well as linen, papyrus, natron glass and faience, the Egyptian blue-glazed ceramic material whose technology Egyptian craftsmen had mastered over centuries and which remained a sought-after luxury good across the ancient world. In return, Egypt imported silver from the Aegean, timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and the specialized goods that a wealthy and sophisticated court required to maintain its standards. The trade was not simply economic. It was the flow of information, technique, and cultural influence that connected Egypt to the wider world. The numbers are striking. Modern estimates based on the surviving evidence suggest that Naucratis, the Greek trading emporium Psamtik established or expanded in the Western Delta, may have been among the most commercially active sites in the ancient Mediterranean by the mid-6th century BC. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted in the late 19th century by the British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, whose work at Naucratis remains foundational despite its age, revealed enormous quantities of Greek pottery, votive objects, and architectural remains from this period. The volume of material suggests that thousands of people were living and working at the site, and the range of Greek origins represented. Pottery from Chios, Miletus, Rhodes, Corinth, and many other centres indicates that Naucratis was drawing merchants from across the Greek world. Petrie himself, standing in the trenches at Naucratis in 1884, looking at the layers of Greek pottery accumulating in the Egyptian desert, is reported to have remarked that he had not expected to find Greece in Egypt. The comment captures something important. The Sais period is the moment when the two civilizations, Egyptian and Greek, first came into genuinely sustained, institutionalized contact, and the consequences of that contact ripple through everything that follows in the ancient world. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, probably around 450 to 440 BC, spent more time writing about Egypt than about any other country outside Greece. His second book, the Histories volume devoted to Egypt, is a remarkable document, part reliable history, part tourist's account, part theological inquiry, and part the kind of credulous recording of temple priests' exaggerated claims that makes modern historians both grateful and cautious. But what the Egyptian sections of Herodotus tell us is that Sais Egypt had made an enormous impression on the Greek world. The priests at Memphis and Heliopolis, when Herodotus visited them, spoke of their civilization's antiquity with a confidence that struck even this well-travelled Greek as overwhelming. They told him that Egyptian history stretched back more than 11,000 years before his visit, a number that was certainly exaggerated, reflecting the priestly tradition of projecting the reign of the gods into historical time, but that expressed something real. A civilization whose self-understanding was built on a foundation of time so deep that it made the Greeks feel like children. This is the Egypt that Psamtik created, or rather, restored and repackaged for a new era. An Egypt that could meet the Greek world on its own terms, engage with it commercially and intellectually, and still maintain its own profound sense of identity, rooted in a tradition 3,000 years old. This was not an easy balance to maintain. The history of the 26th dynasty after Psamtik is, in part, a history of how that balance was maintained, strained, and eventually broken, not by any single catastrophic event, but by the slow, inexorable pressure of a world that was changing faster than any single civilization could fully absorb. The Persian invasion of 525 BC, 18 years after the death of Psamtik I's grandson Apries, and under the reign of Psamtik III, ended the Sais dynasty in a single military campaign conducted by Cambyses II of Persia. Egypt became a Persian province. It would remain under foreign rule, Persian, Macedonian, Greek, and eventually Roman, for the next 2,500 years, with only brief exceptions, until the modern era. The recovery that Psamtik I had engineered, the independence that had seemed so hard-won and so genuine, lasted exactly 138 years. 138 years. That is, roughly, the distance between the birth of the oldest person alive today and the present moment. It is a span of time that feels significant to us, 3 or 4 generations, enough for the memory of those alive at the beginning to have faded from living recall by the end. But against the backdrop of Egyptian history, against the 3,000 years of pharaonic continuity that Psamtik was explicitly invoking when he sent his artists to copy the Old Kingdom originals, 138 years is barely a breath, and it gets stranger, and more poignant when you consider that the Sais Egyptians themselves may have understood this. The archaizing program, the desperate insistence on the oldest forms, the systematic reproduction of the oldest styles. Was this the confidence of a civilization certain of its continuity? Or was it the anxiety of a people who sensed, somewhere beneath the surface of the restoration, that something had been irreparably changed, that the recovery, however real and however remarkable, was also a kind of goodbye to something that could not quite be brought all the way back? We cannot answer this with certainty. The ancient Egyptians did not leave us the kind of personal, introspective record that would allow a definitive answer. But the question, once asked, does not go away. It sits in the beautifully carved faces of Sais statuary. It echoes through the meticulous copies of Old Kingdom inscriptions. It whispers in the legal text of the Nitocris adoption stele, with its careful enumeration of properties and privileges, as if the act of writing it all down in careful legal language could hold the world in place. There is another dimension to the core problem of this era that deserves careful attention, because it shapes everything that comes after. The question of what happened to the memory of Psamtik himself, and why the man who accomplished all of this has been so thoroughly forgotten by everyone who came after. The answer is partly geographical and partly historiographical, a word that means, essentially, about the history of how history gets written. Egyptian history, as most of the modern world understands, it was filtered from antiquity onward, primarily through Greek and Roman sources. Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century. Diodorus Siculus wrote about Egypt in the 1st century BC. Strabo described it in the 1st century of the Common Era. Plutarch wrote about Isis and Osiris, and the theological traditions of the Nile Valley as late as the 1st century CE. These writers are invaluable. Without them, the outline of Egyptian history would be far more obscure than it is, but they came with their own agendas, their own cultural frameworks, and their own sense of what was worth recording and what was not. For Greek writers, Egypt was most interesting as an ancient mystery, a civilization of staggering antiquity whose origins predated anything the Greeks could claim, and whose theological and philosophical traditions seemed to contain the seeds of what the Greeks themselves were doing. The Egypt that fascinated Greek writers was the Egypt of the pyramids, the Egypt of the Sphinx, the Egypt of the Sphinx-lined avenues, and the colossal statuary. that expressed a relationship to time and to the divine that felt alien and overwhelming and profound. The Sais period, recent, pragmatic, commercially active, politically complex, was harder to romanticize. It was Egypt being engaged with the Mediterranean world rather than standing apart from it. And that engagement was, from the Greek perspective, in part a story about Greek influence on Egypt rather than the other way around. This Greek filter shaped how Egyptian history was remembered and transmitted, and it created a systematic bias toward the most ancient and the most dramatic over the more recent and the more complex. The men and women of Sais Egypt were real people, living in a real civilization of considerable accomplishment. But they existed in the textual shadow of the pyramid builders, the conquest pharaohs, and the theological traditions that Greek visitors found so awe-inspiring. They were overshadowed, in other words, by the very past they were trying to restore. The modern rediscovery of the Sais period has been slow, and is still in many respects incomplete. The primary sites associated with the dynasty, Sais itself, in the Western Delta, have been particularly difficult to excavate. The Delta is a living agricultural landscape, densely populated, crisscrossed by ancient and modern irrigation channels, and covered by meters of Nile silt that has accumulated over the past 2.5 millennia. The mounds that mark ancient sites in the Delta are often directly underneath modern villages and towns, making systematic excavation impossible without displacing living communities. Sais, the city that Psamtik called home, and that his dynasty made the capital of Egypt, has been almost completely consumed by the modern town of Sail Hagar. Archaeologists working in the area can collect surface finds and probe at the edges of the site, but the city itself, the palaces, the great temple of Neith, that was one of the most important religious centers of the late period, the royal cemetery where Psamtik himself was buried, lies beneath the foundations of houses where people are currently eating dinner. The scholar who has done more than anyone else in the modern era to excavate the history of the Sais period from this textual and physical obscurity is the British Egyptologist Anthony Leahy, whose work on the 26th dynasty has produced some of the most detailed reconstructions of the period available in the scholarly literature. But even Leahy's work, rigorous, careful, deeply sourced, is known only to academic specialists. The broader public history has not yet caught up. This gap between what specialists know and what general audiences are told is itself a kind of loss. The story of Psamtik I is not a marginal footnote in Egyptian history. It is a story about how civilizations survive, about the particular combination of strategic intelligence, cultural sensitivity, political patience, and genuine commitment to the traditions one is trying to preserve that makes recovery possible rather than impossible. It is a story that has a great deal to say to any age that finds itself managing the aftermath of disruption, trying to rebuild coherence from fragmentation, trying to hold onto an identity under pressure from forces that would dissolve it. The silence around Psamtik is therefore not just a historical injustice, it is a practical loss. The physical remains of Psamtik's Egypt are scattered and uneven. The Delta capital at Sais is effectively inaccessible. The mercenary camps at Daphne were excavated by Petrie in the 1880s and yielded important material, but the site has not been comprehensively re-excavated with modern methods. Naucratis has seen more sustained scholarly attention, but the site is large, the records from early excavations are imperfect, and significant portions remain either unexcavated or inaccessible. The great temples of Upper Egypt, Karnak, Luxor, Memphis, carry Sais period additions and modifications, but these tend to be modest compared to the enormous New Kingdom building programs, and they are frequently overlooked by visitors focused on the more visually dramatic older structures. The Saite material that does survive in museums, the bronzes, the wooden coffins with their dense hieroglyphic texts, the shaptis, the faience amulets, the statuary, tends to sit in middle galleries between the crowd-drawing objects of the Old and New Kingdoms, and to attract specialist attention without capturing the popular imagination in the way that Tutankhamun's gold or the Rosetta Stone do. There is a photograph of a Saite period bronze cat, sleek, perfectly proportioned, its surface patinated to the deepest green-black imaginable. In the collection of the British Museum, that any artist who studies it is likely to remember for a long time. It sits in its case, approximately 3,000 years removed from the hand that made it, and it looks exactly as if it were completed yesterday. It looks, in fact, like modernity was invented to accommodate it, and most visitors to the museum walk past it without stopping. This, too, is part of the core problem. The silence around Psamtik and his dynasty is maintained not by any active suppression, but by the accumulated weight of aesthetic preferences, narrative habits, and historical frameworks that direct attention toward the dramatic and the ancient, and away from the complex and the late. Changing that requires nothing more and nothing less than the willingness to look at what is actually there. Chapter 1. The Oracle and the Bronze Men. In the spring of 664 CCZ, according to later Egyptian tradition preserved in Herodotus, a group of Ionian and Carian Greek soldiers arrived on the Egyptian coast. Their ships had been storm-driven off course, or so the story goes, and they had landed on Egyptian soil without invitation. They wore bronze armor. They carried bronze weapons. The Egyptians who saw them had never encountered soldiers equipped like this. Men wrapped in gleaming metal from head to foot, moving in disciplined formations, speaking a language no one on the Nile could understand. Word reached the young ruler of Sais, who had recently been installed by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal as the vassal administrator of the Western Delta. Psamtik's reaction to this news, if we accept the tradition Herodotus recorded, was immediate and decisive. He had recently consulted the oracle of the goddess Neith at Sais, the ancient protective deity of the city, associated with weaving, with warfare, and with the primal waters from which all creation emerged. And the oracle had told him something that had stayed with him. It had told him that his unification of Egypt would come through the intervention of men of bronze from the sea. The math was striking. Here were men of bronze. They had come from the sea. The gods had spoken, and the moment had arrived. Now, the careful historian has to insert a note of caution here. The oracle tradition in ancient sources is always suspect. Oracles have a remarkable tendency to predict exactly what later happened, and the neat coincidence between the prophecy and the arrival of the mercenaries may well be a later retroactive interpretation. The kind of story that grows around successful historical figures after the fact, providing divine sanction for decisions that were made on entirely practical grounds. Psamtik may have known about the Greek mercenaries before the oracle was consulted. The oracle may have been delivered after the mercenaries arrived, providing religious cover for a decision already made. We do not know. The honest answer is that the boundary between genuine religious experience and politically useful narrative in the ancient world is almost always impossible to locate with certainty. What we do know is what Psamtik did next. He hired the Greeks. He paid them from the revenues of his Delta Principality. He assigned them to fight alongside his existing forces, and he began, carefully and systematically, to use them to extend his control over the other rulers of the Delta. The Carian and Ionian Greek soldiers who served Psamtik were not a minor tactical supplement. They were the decisive military factor in a regional conflict that had been stalemated by the mutual deterrence of comparable local forces. The Greeks fought in a formation, the phalanx, that relied on soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, long spears projecting forward in multiple ranks, and collective discipline holding the line against individual disintegration. The effectiveness of this formation against opponents who had not trained to counter it was profound. It compressed the chaos of ancient battlefield combat into a wall of bronze and wood that could grind through less organized opposition with terrible efficiency. The Delta rulers who opposed Psamtik had armies. They had chariots, archers, and infantry levies drawn from the farming population of their territories. They did not have phalanxes. Each engagement that went against them was not just a tactical defeat, but a revelation of a new military reality they had not prepared for. The psychological impact was real. The Battle of Megiddo, 1,500 years earlier, had been won by New Kingdom pharaohs using chariot tactics that opponents on foot could not match. Now the equation had inverted, and the man who controlled the new technology was the young prince of Sais. who had spent his formative years in the household of the most powerful empire on earth, and had come home with a very clear idea of what military effectiveness required. Within approximately 9 years, by 656 BC, Psamtik controlled the delta. The Nitocris adoption stele records the extension of his authority to Upper Egypt in that same year. The reunification was effectively complete. What is worth slowing down to appreciate is what this moment meant in practical human terms. Somewhere in Sais, in the temple precinct of Neith, most likely, amid the smell of incense and the sound of ritual chant and the cool shadow of ancient carved pillars, there was a ceremony, or a series of ceremonies, in which the priests of Egypt formally recognized Psamtik as the legitimate pharaoh of the two lands, the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, the living Horus, the son of Ra. These were titles that Egyptian priests had been using for 3,000 years, but for the first time in nearly a century, they were being applied to a man who was actually in control of the whole country, and who was Egyptian. The priests who performed those ceremonies would have understood the weight of what they were doing. They carried the institutional memory of pharaonic Egypt in their bodies, in their training, in the texts they had memorized and the rituals they had performed since childhood. When they placed the double crown on Psamtik's head, or performed whatever ceremony accomplished the same symbolic work, they were asserting something that 4 centuries of fragmentation had made impossible to assert in good faith, that Egypt was whole, and that its divine order had been restored. Let that sink in. 3,000 years of civilization, 100 years of occupation and fragmentation, and now restored, not by a foreign conqueror adopting Egyptian identity as political theatre, but by a man born in Egypt, whose family had maintained its connection to the oldest Egyptian city across 2 generations of Assyrian domination, who had returned from exile and achieved through patience and intelligence what brute force had been unable to accomplish for a century. Chapter 2. What the soldiers built, the Greek mercenaries, who helped Psamtik unify Egypt, did not go home after the campaign was over. This is a fact that tends to get either overlooked or mentioned in passing in accounts of the period, but it deserves sustained attention because what happened to these communities over the following generations is one of the more remarkable cultural stories of the ancient world. Psamtik settled the Ionian and Carian soldiers at 2 camps in the eastern delta. The sites known in Greek as stratopaeda, meaning army camps, and in the Egyptian sources as something approximating the camp. The larger settlement was associated with the site of Daphne, the modern Tel Dafana in the northeastern delta near the Suez Canal. Herodotus visited the site more than a century later and described seeing the remains of the camps clearly visible. His account is confirmed by Petrie's excavations in 1884, which uncovered Greek pottery in enormous quantities. Pottery consistent with the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, exactly the period when the mercenary settlements would have been established and growing. Petrie's dig at Daphne produced one of the most striking accumulations of Greek ceramic evidence from Egypt. Thousands of fragments of Ionian, East Greek, and Corinthian wares mixed with Egyptian material in a way that illustrated precisely the kind of cultural layering that characterized the Site period. The Greek soldiers and their families were eating Greek food from Greek pots, worshipping their own gods in their own language, and simultaneously living within Egyptian administrative structures, surrounded by Egyptian religious practice, intermarrying in some cases with local Egyptian families, and gradually accumulating the kind of deep familiarity with their host civilization that comes from living within it for a generation, rather than simply trading with it or fighting against it. The scholar Boardman, writing about Greeks overseas in the ancient Mediterranean, described the Egyptian mercenary settlements as unique among Greek colonial communities of the period, not because they were the largest or the most economically significant, but because of the specific character of their relationship with the host civilization. Most Greek colonies in this era were established on the edges of what Greeks considered the inhabited world, in territories where the local populations were either absent or could be managed. The Egyptian settlements were something different. Communities of Greeks embedded within one of the most ancient, the most institutionally sophisticated, and the most culturally self-assured civilizations that had ever existed, and which had absolutely no intention of being displaced or transformed by its guests. The result was a process of mutual influence, measured, limited, controlled on the Egyptian side by the deliberate cultural conservatism of the archaizing program, and by the institutional weight of the temple establishments, but real and gradual on both sides. Greeks who spent years in Egypt went home changed. They had encountered a civilization that made the entire Greek tradition look young. They had spoken with priests who could recite the histories of their temples, going back 2,000 years and more. They had seen architectural forms and artistic canons so ancient and so refined that comparing them to what the Greeks were building felt like comparing a mature tree to a sapling. And some of what they absorbed came back with them, in the forms of Greek architecture, in the proportions of early Greek sculpture, in the philosophical traditions that Greek thinkers would develop in the 6th and 5th centuries BC that drew on Egyptian mathematical and theological knowledge, in ways that are still debated by scholars of the classical world. This is not science fiction. The connections between Egyptian knowledge and early Greek intellectual development are not the invention of romantic enthusiasts. They are documented, argued over, and taken seriously by specialists who have spent careers studying both civilizations. The precise nature and extent of the influence is genuinely contested. This is one of the areas where the scholarly debate is both most heated and most important. But the existence of some influence is not in doubt, and it runs in significant part through the Sais period, through Naucratis and the mercenary camps, through the Egyptian tour of Solon the Athenian statesman that later sources report, through Herodotus's careful questioning of the Memphis and Heliopolis priests. 2 generations after Psamtik's death. Chapter 3. The name on the stone. In the summer of 1865, an Egyptologist named Heinrich Brugsch was working at the site of Memphis, the ancient capital, the city at the junction of the Nile Valley and the Delta, when he came across a collection of funerary documents that had been extracted from the Serapeum, the great underground necropolis of the sacred Apis bulls, the Serapeum, excavated by the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, beginning in 1851, in one of the most dramatic archaeological campaigns of the 19th century, was a system of underground galleries carved into the bedrock beneath the desert plateau at Saqqara, containing the granite sarcophagi of the Apis bulls, venerated at Memphis across more than 1,000 years of pharaonic history. The Apis bull was one of the most sacred animals in the Egyptian religious system, the living manifestation of the god Ptah at Memphis, identified by specific markings including a white diamond on its forehead and a black vulture shape on its back. When an Apis bull died, it was mummified with the same care and ceremonial attention given to royal burials, and its sarcophagus was installed in the galleries of the Serapeum, with inscriptions recording the dates of its birth, its installation, and its death. These inscriptions, once deciphered, provided Egyptologists with one of the most precise chronological records of the entire late period, a series of dates calibrated against the reigns of specific pharaohs that allowed scholars to fix the chronology of the 26th dynasty with unusual accuracy. When Brugsch examined the Apis bull stelae associated with the reign of Psamtik I, he found something that moved him even by the standards of a man who spent his career surrounded by extraordinary objects. The stelae recording the installation of a new Apis bull in the first year of Psamtik's reign, that is, around 664 BC, near the very beginning of the Sais period, was accompanied by a record so carefully dated, so precisely formulated, that it could be used to anchor the entire chronology of the dynasty. The inscription was routine by pharaonic standards, a record of divine honor, a catalogue of ritual obligations, but in it, the young Psamtik was named with his full royal titulary. All 5 of the royal names that a pharaoh assumed at coronation, each one a theological statement connecting him to specific divine qualities and to the ancient line of kings stretching back to the beginning. Brugsch later wrote that, reading that titulary in context, understanding that this was a man who had recently reconstituted pharaonic authority from a position of vassal subordination to the most powerful empire on earth, gave him one of the most profound experiences of his scholarly career. Not a dramatic discovery, not the uncovering of a hidden tomb, but the moment when a collection of carved signs on a piece of stone resolved into the full weight of what they meant. That is the experience of good Egyptology at its best. It is not the dramatic excavation of a famous golden tomb. It is the patient accumulation of careful reading, careful dating, careful contextualization. And then the moment when everything aligns and the past becomes, for a second, as present and immediate as the air in the room. Chapter 4. The Mercenaries' Graffiti in 1821. A French expedition travelling through Upper Egypt reached the great temples at Abu Simbel, the site in southern Egypt near the modern border with Sudan, where the pharaoh Ramesses II had carved two enormous temples directly into the sandstone cliffs in the 13th century BC. The temples had been partially covered by drifting sand for centuries, and had only recently been cleared by the Italian adventurer Giovanni Belzoni in one of the more romantically charged episodes of early Egyptology. On the left leg of one of the colossal seated statues of Ramesses that guard the entrance to the Great Temple, the seated figures that rise 20 meters from the rock face, each face wide enough for a person to stand inside the open mouth. The expedition found something unexpected. Scratched into the ancient stone, in the Greek alphabet, was an inscription. Not a hieroglyphic text, not an Egyptian priestly record. A Greek graffito, carved by Greek soldiers into the greatest monument of the greatest military pharaoh in Egyptian history. The inscription, when deciphered, turned out to be one of the most important historical documents from the reign of Psamtik II, the grandson of Psamtik I, recording a military expedition that had travelled up the Nile into Nubia around 591 BC. The soldiers who carved it were Greek mercenaries, the descendants or successors of the men that Psamtik I had hired more than 70 years earlier. They were recording their presence, their expedition, their own names, in a place so remote and so overwhelming that even in the 21st century of the modern era, standing beneath those colossal faces in the Nubian heat, a person feels the full weight of distance from the familiar world. The Abu Simbel inscription is now known as the Carian Greek inscription, and it is one of the primary sources for the date of Psamtik II's Nubian campaign. It names specific soldiers: Archon the son of Amoibichos, Pelikos the son of Udamos, Telephanes the Alasan, Pabis the Colophonian, men whose names have survived 3,000 years, not because they were important officials or famous warriors, but because they carved their names into a rock far from home, the way soldiers everywhere have always marked the proof that they were present, that they existed, that the stone itself would remember them even if no one else did. The scholars who first read the inscription in the early 19th century were struck by the same thing that strikes modern readers: the humanity of it. These are not diplomatic texts or religious formulae. These are people. They were young, probably, and far from home, and they stood in the shadow of monuments 1,000 years old, and felt the need to say, "We were here." That impulse, to leave a mark, to insist on one's own reality against the indifference of time, is as familiar as anything in the human experience, and it connects directly back to Psamtik I, who had created the conditions that made their presence possible. The military colonies he established, the policy of integrating Greek soldiers into the Egyptian military structure, the openness to foreign expertise that characterized the Sais period from its very beginning. All of this was already 3 generations old when those soldiers stood at Abu Simbel and scratched their names into the rock. They were the consequence of a decision made by a young man standing in the Delta a lifetime before, a decision to use foreign military expertise to restore Egyptian independence and then to welcome the foreigners as permanent residents of the world they had helped create. Chapter 5. The Scribes Who Kept Everything. There is a category of evidence for the Sais period that is simultaneously the most abundant and the least glamorous: the papyrus documents. Not royal inscriptions or temple reliefs or monumental architecture, but the everyday paperwork of an operating civilization. The contracts, the wills, the tax records, the legal disputes, the letters. These documents survive imperfectly, dependent on the accident of burial in dry desert conditions, but enough of them have come through to give historians a remarkable window into how Sais Egypt actually functioned at the level of ordinary life. The most significant collection of Sais period papyri is associated with a site in Upper Egypt known to modern scholarship as Elephantine, the island at the First Nile Cataract, at the modern city of Aswan, that marked the traditional southern border of Egypt proper. Elephantine was a garrison town, a trading post, and a religious centre of considerable importance, and it has produced, over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries of modern archaeology, a collection of administrative and legal documents that illuminate the daily workings of the late period state with unusual clarity. The Elephantine papyri include documents in both Egyptian Demotic script, the flowing, abbreviated form of Egyptian writing that was becoming the standard script of everyday life in the Seti period, and in Aramaic, the international administrative language of the Near East that Assyrian and later Persian administrative practice had spread across the entire region. The bilingual character of the archive reflects precisely the cosmopolitan reality of Sais Egypt, a civilization managing its internal affairs in its own ancient language, whilst simultaneously participating in an international commercial and diplomatic world that required the use of a shared lingua franca, a demotic legal contract from the reign of Psamtik I, discovered in the late 19th century, and now in the collection of the Louvre in Paris, records a property dispute between two Egyptian families in a provincial town somewhere in the Delta. The names of the parties are Egyptian. The legal framework is Egyptian, drawing on traditions of property law that had been developing in the Nile Valley for millennia. The bureaucratic procedure, the filing of the dispute with the local authority, the recording of testimony, the formal adjudication, follows practices continuous with the New Kingdom administrative tradition. The document is, in short, completely Egyptian in every significant respect, and yet it was produced within a system that the young Psamtik had restored from near collapse within the previous decade. The families in that contract were going about their lives, buying and selling property, resolving disputes through a functioning legal system, trusting that the institutions of the state would honour their contracts and their claims, because a man they had probably never seen and might barely have known by name had spent 14 years carefully, patiently, strategically reconstructing the political order that made ordinary civilian life possible. This is the part of Psamtik's story that is hardest to make visible in the conventional forms of historical narrative, because it is about the absence of catastrophe. The families in that papyrus were not experiencing extraordinary events. They were experiencing normality, the normality of a functioning state, with courts and scribes and recognized procedures. That normality is exactly what had been absent for a century. Its restoration was Psamtik's greatest achievement, and because it was an achievement that expressed itself as the continuation of ordinary life rather than as a dramatic event, it is almost invisible in retrospect. But here is the echo that runs through everything. The demotic script in that papyrus, the flowing, efficient, abbreviated writing system that was becoming the standard everyday script of Egypt during the Sais period, would eventually evolve into the Coptic script used by the Egyptian Christian community from late antiquity through the medieval period and still used in Coptic Christian liturgy today. The language written in those Sais period documents, Egyptian in its latest traditional form, is the direct ancestor of the language in which the Coptic priests of Egypt still conduct their services 3,000 years later. The living Christian liturgy of the Egyptian Church is, in a real and traceable sense, a descendant of the scribal tradition that Psamtik's restoration preserved. That connection, from a 7th century BC pharaoh's political recovery to a 21st century religious service in a church in Cairo or Alexandria or the Coptic diaspora, is the kind of thread that makes the study of ancient history feel like something more than antiquarianism. It is the evidence that nothing is ever completely lost. That some things, if they are valued enough and held carefully enough, can be carried across distances of time that seem to make survival impossible. Psamtik held it. His dynasty held it for 5 more generations. And when the Persians finally came, in 525 BC, and the Sais dynasty fell, the scribal tradition passed into new hands. Persian, then Greek, then Roman, but it continued. The temples kept operating. The hieroglyphs kept being carved. The priests kept chanting. Egypt absorbed its conquerors more thoroughly than its conquerors absorbed Egypt. That, too, is part of Psamtik's legacy. He built something that outlasted him more completely than he could have known. Chapter 6. The city that Naucratis built in 1884, the British archaeologist William Matthew Flinders Petrie, 22 years old, precise, driven, and already developing the methodological habits that would make him one of the transformative figures in the history of Egyptology. Arrived at a site in the Western Delta, near the modern Egyptian village of Komgiyif, he had been directed there by reports of unusual quantities of Greek pottery appearing in the hands of local farmers and antiquities dealers. The pottery itself was distinctive, not Egyptian in form or fabric, but clearly Greek and clearly old. Petrie suspected he had found Naucratis, the Greek trading city in Egypt mentioned by Herodotus, by Strabo, and by a dozen other ancient sources, but never previously located. He was right. The excavation that followed, conducted over several seasons and later continued by other archaeologists, revealed a site of substantial complexity, a city that had been established in the Sais period, almost certainly during the reign of Psamtik I, or his immediate successors, and that had grown across the 6th and 5th centuries BC into one of the most commercially active points in the ancient Mediterranean world. The pottery alone was extraordinary, not just in its quantity, but in its range. Petrie found Greek material from Chios and Miletus in Ionia, from Rhodes, from Corinth, from Aegina, from Naucratis itself. Evidence of a trading community drawing participants from across the Greek world. He found Egyptian religious objects alongside Greek votive offerings. He found the remains of Greek temples, sanctuaries to the Dioscuri, to Apollo, to Hera, coexisting with Egyptian religious structures in a spatial proximity that speaks to a genuine, sustained cultural cohabitation rather than simple commercial exchange. The Hellenian, the great shared sanctuary that Herodotus describes as being maintained jointly by 9 Greek city-states, was one of the most remarkable institutions of the ancient commercial world. 9 independent city-states, with their own political systems, their own religious traditions, and their own often competing commercial interests, maintaining a shared religious and commercial institution in a foreign country. The organizational achievement is striking even by modern standards. The political will required to sustain it. The agreements, the negotiations, the ongoing management of competing interests suggests a level of institutional sophistication that challenges the sometimes condescending way that popular history tends to treat the ancient world. Petrie himself was not given to romantic excesses, but he later wrote that Naucratis was the site that had most consistently surprised him in his long career in Egypt. He had expected to find a minor trading post. He found evidence of a sustained and complex cultural encounter that had left traces in almost every category of material he could analyze: pottery, architecture, religious objects, personal ornaments, and the faint outlines of buildings that had been substantial even by the standards of ancient cities. The math is striking when you try to think about the population of Naucratis at its height. Petrie estimated, on the basis of the site's extent and the density of material, that it had housed several thousand permanent residents, with a much larger floating population of merchants, sailors, and seasonal traders passing through. Some modern estimates run higher, up to 10 or 20,000 in peak periods. Whatever the precise number, this was not a minor outpost. This was a functioning city, a genuine meeting point of civilizations, operating within the political and administrative framework that Psamtik's dynasty had created. What Naucratis produced, in the broadest sense, was not just commercial activity. It produced knowledge exchange of a kind that had no real precedent in the ancient world. The Egyptian priests at the nearby temples, at Sais, at Memphis, at Heliopolis, had been accumulating and systematizing knowledge for 3,000 years. They had developed mathematical techniques for calculating the volumes of pyramidal shapes and the areas of irregular fields. They had compiled medical knowledge in texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a surgical manual of astonishing sophistication describing specific injury types with an anatomical precision that suggests direct clinical observation rather than theoretical speculation, and the Ebers Papyrus, a collection of nearly 900 medical formulae and prescriptions that remain the most comprehensive pharmacological text in the ancient Mediterranean world for centuries. They had developed astronomical, observational traditions, precise enough to produce the calendar that Egypt used across 3,000 years, and that forms the direct ancestor of the Julian and Gregorian calendars used today. And now, at Naucratis, some of this knowledge was reaching Greek visitors. Not all of it. The deepest temple knowledge was restricted to initiates, and Egyptian priests were not in the habit of sharing theological and scientific secrets with curious foreigners. But some of it filtered through in conversations, in demonstrations, in the implicit lessons of encountered architecture and observed ritual. The Greek visitors who spent time in Egypt were not passive tourists. They were intellectually active people in the era when Greek thought was undergoing its formative transformation, and what they saw in Egypt, the scale, the antiquity, the systematic organization of knowledge, the integration of mathematics and architecture and theology into a single coherent system, challenged and stimulated them in ways that mattered. The philosopher Thales of Miletus, credited by later Greek tradition as the first figure in the Greek philosophical tradition, is said by several ancient sources to have travelled to Egypt and to have learned geometry there. Whether this specific account is accurate is uncertain, but Thales was from Miletus, one of the Ionian Greek cities most heavily represented in the Naucratis community, and was active in exactly the period when the Site period was at its height. The intellectual environment that produced Thales was the same environment that produced the Naucratis experiment, and the connection, while not provable with certainty, is not implausible. This is not science fiction, and it is not the kind of romantic overclaiming that sometimes embarrasses the serious study of cultural influence. It is the careful observation that when two sophisticated civilizations come into sustained, institutionalized contact, ideas move between them, not cleanly, not in documented transactions, but through the slow accumulation of encounters, observations, and conversations that leave no direct trace in the historical record, but whose consequences can sometimes be inferred from what happened afterward in each civilization's intellectual life. Chapter 7. The Apis Bulls and the Long Calendar. The sacred bulls of Memphis are one of the stranger threads in the fabric of Egyptian religious life, and they deserve a moment's attention here because of what the Apis bull records from the Site period tell us about how Psamtik and his successors understood their own place in history. Each Apis bull, when it died, was mummified with extraordinary care and buried in the Serapeum at Saqqara in a massive granite sarcophagus. The stelae that accompanied these burials recorded the dates of the bull's life with a precision that was, for the ancient world, remarkable. The installation date, the death date, and the dates of key ritual events during the bull's lifetime were all carved into the record. This precision was not administrative fastidiousness for its own sake. It was a theological statement. That time, in Egypt, was not simply the passage of days and years, but the sacred marking of divine events, and that the pharaoh's role was to maintain the orderly recording of this sacred time. When modern Egyptologists began working with the Apis bull stelae in the 19th century, they realized that they had, in these dry records of bovine biographies, one of the most precise chronological anchors available for the entire late period. The dates on the stelae could be checked against astronomical records, against the chronologies of other ancient peoples, against the Babylonian Chronicle, against the Hebrew Bible. They interlocked with other evidence in ways that allowed scholars to construct a detailed timeline of the 26th dynasty, with a confidence not always available for earlier periods. And what this timeline revealed was something that added a different dimension to the understanding of Psamtik's achievement. The Apis bull records from his reign show a dynasty that was meticulous about its theological obligations from the very first year, that treated the maintenance of the divine calendar and the proper conduct of religious ritual not as optional cultural activities, but as the primary obligation of the state. This was not unusual by pharaonic standards, but it stood in sharp contrast to the preceding century of fragmentation, during which the records are less complete and less systematically maintained. Psamtik was rebuilding not just political authority but theological time. He was insisting, through the careful maintenance of the Apis records and through the establishment of proper ritual at every major temple, that the sacred calendar of Egypt, the endless cycle of divine events and human obligations that had been running continuously for 3,000 years, had not been broken by the century of chaos. That Egypt's sacred time had continued, underground, in the memories of the priests and the maintenance of the temples, even when political authority had fragmented, and that now, with the country reunified under a legitimate pharaoh, that sacred time was flowing openly again, as it always had and always would. Let that sink in. 3,000 years of continuous sacred record-keeping. A civilization that understood its own existence, not in centuries or generations, but in the long, slow rhythm of divine time, stretching back to the creation of the world. And a man, in the middle of the 7th century BC, deliberately and consciously inserting himself into that rhythm, not as an interruption or a new beginning, but as a restoration of what had always been. The arrogance of that claim is overwhelming, and so is its beauty. The Apis bull, whose installation Psamtik's scribes carefully recorded in his first regnal year, was, in the eyes of the priests who attended it, the direct successor of Apis bulls going back 2,000 years. Its sarcophagus would eventually join in the galleries of the Serapeum, the sarcophagi of bulls from the New Kingdom, from the Second Intermediate Period, from the Middle Kingdom. When Mariette's excavations opened those galleries in the 1850s, the sheer scale of the accumulated sarcophagi, each one weighing between 60 and 70 metric tons, each one perfectly fitted into its gallery with a precision that astonished the engineers who examined them, was one of the great archaeological revelations of the modern era. Here was the physical embodiment of 3,000 years of continuous religious practice, sealed underground in stone so massive that even the grave robbers who had penetrated other Egyptian sacred sites had been unable to move them. Psamtik's Apis was in there too, among the great granite boxes, his name on the stele, his reign's dates carefully recorded, his theological legitimacy asserted in the formal language of a tradition he had devoted his entire reign to restoring. Somewhere in the desert plateau at Saqqara, under the sand and the rock, those records still exist. Chapter 8. The failure that was not a failure. There is a question that haunts the Sais period when you look at it with the clear eyes of retrospect. If Psamtik's restoration was so thorough, so institutionally deep, so culturally rich, why did it last only 138 years? The Persian invasion of 525 BC ended the 26th dynasty quickly. Cambyses II of Persia faced Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, in the northeastern delta, almost certainly near the same terrain where Psamtik I had conducted his campaign of reunification a century and a half earlier. The battle was decisive. Greek mercenaries fought on both sides. The Persian victory was followed by Psamtik III's capture and eventual death, and the country passed, within a single campaign season, into Persian control. Why so quickly? Part of the answer is military. The Persian army under Cambyses was a formidable force, and by the late 6th century BC, it had already conquered the Lydian kingdom, the Babylonian Empire, and much of the ancient Near East. Egypt was not uniquely vulnerable. It was simply the next target of an imperial juggernaut that was, in its own era, as overwhelming as Assyria had been a century and a half before. Part of the answer is internal. The reign of the last Saite pharaoh, Ahmose II, had been long and commercially successful, but had left certain tensions unresolved, particularly between the traditional temple establishments and the increasingly Greek-influenced commercial elite that had grown up around Naucratis and the Delta trading cities. Cambyses exploited these tensions skillfully. He presented himself, at least in the early stages of his Egyptian campaign, as a respectful inheritor of pharaonic tradition, rather than a destroyer of it. But there is a third part of the answer that the evidence forces us to confront, and it is the most sobering. The success of Psamtik's cultural program had created the conditions for a particular kind of vulnerability. The archaizing movement had been so successful, and the integration of Greek commercial communities had been so extensive that the Egypt of 525 BC was genuinely cosmopolitan, genuinely open to the wider Mediterranean world in ways that made it attractive and manageable to a Persian administration that already knew how to govern cosmopolitan societies. The very openness that had made the Sais period culturally rich also made the administrative transition to Persian rule smoother than it might otherwise have been. This is not a criticism of Psamtik. It is a recognition of an irreducible irony. The qualities that make a civilization adaptive and rich also make it absorbable. The most closed, the most rigidly conservative, the most institutionally isolated civilizations tend to be harder to absorb into imperial systems, and also less intellectually generative, less commercially dynamic, less capable of the creative exchange that drives cultural development. Psamtik chose openness, the Sais period chose cosmopolitanism. This was the right choice, and it created a wonderful civilization that lasted, under Egyptian control, for 138 years. 138 years is not a failure. It is, by the standards of most political achievements in recorded human history, a remarkable success. The difficulty is only visible when you hold it against the 3,000-year backdrop of pharaonic tradition that Psamtik was invoking, when you measure it not against ordinary political achievement but against the standard of permanence that Egypt had always claimed as its own. But here is the problem with that measurement. Nothing achieves the permanence that Egypt claimed. Not Egypt, not Assyria, not Babylon, not Persia, not Greece, not Rome. The claim of permanence is always a wish, sometimes a magnificent and ennobling wish, but a wish nonetheless. What Psamtik achieved was not permanence. It was something more honest and perhaps more valuable. A genuine recovery, a real restoration, a century and a half of authentic Egyptian independence that gave the civilization time to transmit its most important qualities to the world that came after. The priests who taught Herodotus about Egyptian history in 450 BC were Site-trained priests, or the students of Site-trained priests. The astronomical and mathematical traditions that passed through Naucratis into the Greek world were Sais period transmissions. The demotic script that the Sais period systematized became the writing system of Egyptian Christianity 1,000 years later. The legal and administrative traditions that Psamtik restored and his successors maintained became the template that even Persian and Macedonian conquerors found it expedient to respect and continue. This is what endurance actually looks like. Not the unchanged persistence of a frozen form, but the transmission of the most essential qualities of a civilization through the hands of those who valued it enough to hold on. There is one more chapter in this section that deserves to be told, because it happened almost exactly at the midpoint of the Sais period, and because it gives a human face, a specific, archaeologically documented human face, to the world that Psamtik had built. Chapter 9. The soldier who wrote his name, the inscription at Abu Simbel, carved by Greek mercenaries during the Nubian campaign of Psamtik II, was mentioned earlier in this section, but it deserves a longer look, because when scholars finally read it carefully in the context of the wider Sais period, it revealed something important about the social world of the dynasty. The men who carved their names on Ramesses' statue were not officers or aristocrats. They were soldiers, professional fighters from Ionian and Carian Greek communities who had been hired by Egypt's pharaoh to conduct a military expedition thousands of kilometers from their homes. Their names are preserved: Archon, Pabus, Telephos. Greek names, several of them, but among the names recorded are also Carian names. The Carian language, spoken in what is now southwestern Turkey, is related to Greek but distinct, and the Carian mercenary tradition was separate from but parallel to the Ionian Greek one. Both communities appear in the Sais military records. Both are present at Abu Simbel. What these men were doing in southern Egypt was conducting a punitive campaign against Kush, the Nubian kingdom that had been the 25th dynasty, expelled from Egypt by the Assyrians 2 generations earlier. Psamtik II's Nubian campaign was one of the more controversial episodes of the Sais period. It achieved little of lasting military consequence. The Kushite kingdom was not destroyed, and the campaign's effects were tactical rather than strategic. But it produced a deliberate cultural erasure that modern Egyptologists have noted with some discomfort. Psamtik II ordered the systematic destruction of the names and images of the Kushite pharaohs at Egyptian temples, chiseling out their cartouches and replacing them with his own or with blanks. The Kushite kings of the 25th dynasty, Taharqa, Shebitku, Shabaka, and Pa, had their monuments defaced at major sites across Egypt. The motivations are debated. Some scholars see it as a straightforward act of political delegitimization, an effort to erase from the official record the period of Kushite rule and assert that the Saite kings were the direct successors of the last legitimate Egyptian pharaohs before the chaos began. Others see it as a response to ongoing Kushite political claims on Egypt, an assertion, in the permanent medium of stone, that the Kushite royal line had no claim to the country. Whatever the motivation, the act was not entirely successful. The Kushite names, while damaged, were not always obliterated beyond identification. Modern Egyptologists working with ultraviolet light and careful photographic techniques have been able to recover many of the erased inscriptions, reading beneath the damage to reconstruct the original texts. The past in Egypt is harder to destroy than it looks. The stone is deep and the record is long, and even determined erasure leaves traces. The soldiers who carved their names at Abu Simbel were not thinking about any of this. They were thinking about the cold Nile wind and the sand and the distance from home. They were thinking about the monument in front of them. The colossal face of Ramesses II staring out across the water with an expression of absolute, serene authority, and they were thinking, perhaps, about their own smallness in the face of something so enormous and so old. And so they wrote their names. They said, "We were here. We passed through this place. We are real, even if the stone is older than anything we can imagine." Their names are still there. Go to Abu Simbel today. It is possible. It is a matter of a flight to Aswan and a bus through the desert, and look at the left leg of the southern colossus. The Greek letters are faint but present, carved by hand in the sandstone, 3,500 years old from the monument, and nearly 2,500 years old from the inscription. Archon, son of Omoibichos, Pabis the Colophonian, Telephanes the Ialisan, they outlasted the empire that hired them. They outlasted the dynasty that built the temple. They outlasted almost everything. That is the strange, haunting mathematics of survival. You cannot always predict what endures. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has spent time with the story of the Sais period. A quiet that is different from the quiet of ordinary unfamiliarity with historical material. It is the quiet of understanding something that should be obvious and somehow is not. Psamtik I took a country that had been occupied, fragmented, and administratively dismembered for nearly a century, and he restored it, gradually, methodically, with extraordinary intelligence and patience, to something approaching its former coherence and dignity. He did it without a decisive military victory against the occupying empire. He did it without the kind of dramatic national uprising that later ages prefer as the narrative of liberation. He did it through maneuvering, alliance building, careful timing, and a deep strategic intelligence that used every resource available to him, foreign and domestic, ancient and new. And then he spent the remaining years of his life rebuilding the institutions of the state, cultivating the loyalty of the temple establishments, sponsoring a systematic artistic and cultural program aimed at reconnecting his dynasty to the deepest roots of Egyptian tradition and opening the country to the commercial and intellectual energies of the wider Mediterranean world. He died in 610 BC after a reign of 54 years, in a world where the average life expectancy at birth was, according to current estimates, well below 40 years, and where political instability made long reigns the exception rather than the rule. 54 years of active, effective rule represents something extraordinary. He outlasted the Assyrian Empire that had installed him. He outlasted the Kushite dynasty that had been expelled by the Assyrians. He lived to see the Neo-Babylonian Empire rise to fill the vacuum left by Assyria's collapse, and he spent the last years of his reign managing Egypt's position in a regional landscape that had been transformed almost beyond recognition from the one he had inherited. Let that sink in. He began his reign as a vassal of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. He ended it as the independent sovereign of a restored Egypt, managing diplomatic relationships with the successor states that had destroyed that empire. The scale of change, measured against the span of a single human life, is vertiginous, and yet he is almost unknown. Ask 10 people who study ancient history at the university level to name the pharaoh who reunified Egypt after the Assyrian occupation. Fewer than 1 in 10 will be able to answer without prompting. Ask a general audience the same question, and the number approaches 0. This is not simply an injustice to a historical figure who deserves better posthumous recognition. It is a symptom of something deeper about how we understand the past, and what we think is worth understanding. The popular history of ancient Egypt has been shaped, profoundly and persistently, by a set of aesthetic preferences and narrative assumptions that were mostly formed in the 19th century of the modern era, when Egyptology was a new discipline and the objects that first captured the public imagination. The pyramids, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the colossal statues of Ramesses, set a template of grandeur and antiquity against which everything else was implicitly measured and found wanting. The Sais period fails this test on the most superficial level. The delta sites are inaccessible or destroyed. The great Site temple of Neith at Sais is gone. The royal tombs at Sais are gone. The palaces are gone. What survives is the smaller scale material. The bronze figures, the papyrus documents, the inscriptions in Upper Egyptian temples, the pottery at Naucratis. That requires specialist knowledge to appreciate and does not photograph dramatically in the way that Ramesses' colossi photograph dramatically. The Site period is not photogenic in the currency of popular Egyptology, and that has cost it enormously in terms of attention. But underneath this aesthetic unfairness, there is something more troubling: the framework within which ancient Egyptian history tends to be presented, a framework of Old Kingdom glory, New Kingdom expansion, and then a long decline toward the inevitable absorption into the Greco-Roman world, leaves no room for the Sate period to be understood as what it actually was. If the third intermediate period was decline, and if the late period that followed was continued decline, then the restoration of the 26th dynasty becomes, within this framework, at best a brief and doomed Indian summer rather than a genuine achievement of civilizational recovery. This framework is wrong. It is not wrong because it is motivated by malice, or because the scholars who worked within it were not serious. It is wrong because it applies a teleological logic, the logic of inevitable decline, to a situation that the people living through it did not experience as inevitable decline, and that the evidence does not support as an accurate characterization. The Sate period was not a glorious last gasp before the inevitable end. It was a genuine renaissance, a real, documented, materially and culturally rich revival of Egyptian civilization that was only ended by the same kind of external military force that had ended every period of Egyptian independence since the New Kingdom. This is not science fiction. This is what the archaeology says when you read it, without the framework of inevitable decline imposed on top of it. The deeper truth of Psamtik's story is about the conditions that make recovery possible. Not just political recovery, the restoration of a unified state, but cultural recovery, the renewal of a civilization's confidence in its own traditions, its own identity, its own capacity to continue being itself in the face of pressure that has been trying to dissolve it. These conditions are not mysterious. Psamtik demonstrated them across 54 years of practice. The first condition is patience. He did not try to expel the Assyrians in the first year of his rule. He did not launch a rebellion that he lacked the forces to sustain. He waited. He built. He maneuvered. He used the legitimacy that Assyrian recognition gave him to extend his authority gradually, and he did not allow impatience to drive him into confrontations he would lose. Patience in the service of a clear strategic goal is one of the rarest qualities in ancient political leadership, or in any political leadership, and Psamtik had it in extraordinary abundance. The second condition is pragmatism without cynicism. He used Greek mercenaries. This offended some of the more traditionally minded Egyptian priests, who saw the presence of foreigners in military roles as a degradation of Egyptian dignity. Psamtik did not dismiss this concern. He accommodated it, settling the mercenaries in their own camps away from the main Egyptian population centers, maintaining the distinction between foreign military specialists and Egyptian civilian life, and simultaneously cultivating the temple establishments that were most likely to object to foreign influence. He was pragmatic enough to use what was available and wise enough to manage the cultural anxieties that pragmatism created. The third condition is rootedness. The archaeizing program was not simply political theatre. It reflected a genuine conviction, Psamtik's own, reinforced by the priests and scholars he surrounded himself with, that the way to restore Egyptian identity was not to innovate a new Egyptian identity, but to reconnect the present to the deepest available past. This required a detailed knowledge of what that past actually looked like, not the romanticized, vaguely remembered past of popular memory, but the specific, documented, carefully studied past of the temple archives and the monument inscriptions. Psamtik's artists went to look at the originals. They studied them. They reproduced them with care. The result was an artistic program that was deeply traditional without being stagnant, a reimagining of ancient forms that retained their power while adapting them to the particular circumstances of the 7th and 6th centuries BC. The fourth condition, and the most counterintuitive one, is openness. The same man who launched the archaizing program was also the man who settled Greek mercenaries in the Delta and expanded the trading city at Naucratis. These two things are not contradictions. They are aspects of the same strategic intelligence. You can be deeply rooted in your own tradition and genuinely open to engaging with the outside world. You can honor what you have inherited and simultaneously use what the wider world offers. The combination is harder to maintain than either extreme, either total closure or total openness, but it is more effective than either extreme, and it is what Psamtik achieved. These conditions are not unique to ancient Egypt. They apply, with obvious modifications for context, to any civilization facing the challenge of recovery from disruption, and there is no shortage of such civilizations in the modern world. The lesson of Psamtik is not that patience and pragmatism and rootedness and openness will always work. They did not work permanently. The Persians came in 525 BC, and the dynasty fell. The lesson is that these qualities give a civilization the best possible chance of sustained recovery, and that their presence or absence in the leadership of a people in crisis makes a difference that can be measured in generations. 138 years of recovered independence. 5 generations of Egyptian pharaohs who governed their own country on their own terms, rebuilt its institutions, cultivated its arts, managed its international relationships, and transmitted its most essential qualities to the civilizations that came after. This is not a small thing. It is not the 3,000-year continuity of the full pharaonic tradition, but it is more than most civilizations facing the conditions that Egypt faced in 664 BC could have achieved. The grief in this story is not the fall of the dynasty. Every dynasty falls. The grief is the silence that followed, not the historical silence of the ancient sources, which is understandable given the fragmentary nature of the evidence, but the modern silence. The decision, made implicitly and accumulated across 2 centuries of popular historical writing, to treat the Sais period as a footnote rather than a chapter, to let 138 years of genuine human achievement disappear not into the desert sand, but into the indifference of narrative convention. The Egyptian priests at Memphis, who instructed Herodotus in the 5th century BC, could recite the names of hundreds of pharaohs going back more than 2,000 years before his visit. They kept the list. They maintained the memory. They understood that the names were important, not because the individual pharaohs who bore them were all of equal significance, but because the list itself was the evidence of continuity, the proof that time had not broken what Egypt was. Psamtik's name was on that list. His successors made sure of it. The priests who maintained the king lists in the Sais period we're making an argument that we can still make today if we choose to. The argument is simply this: he existed, what he did mattered, and the silence around him is a choice, one that can be unmade. There is another dimension of the deeper truth that this story has been building toward, and it requires slowing down and looking at something that is easy to pass over: the question of what Psamtik himself believed he was doing. We cannot enter a mind that has been gone for 2,500 years. We cannot read the private thoughts of a man whose personal correspondence, if he left any, has not survived. What we have are the official records, the inscriptions, the administrative documents, the stelae. And what those records consistently show is a ruler who understood his relationship to the past in terms that were theological and not merely political. He was not simply a king restoring a state. He was a pharaoh restoring cosmic order. The distinction is not trivial. The Egyptian concept of Mat, the divine ordering of the world that the pharaoh was obligated to maintain, encompassed justice, truth, right proportion, and the proper functioning of the natural and divine order simultaneously. A pharaoh who failed to maintain Mat was not merely politically ineffective, he was cosmologically dangerous. The rituals performed in the temples were not symbolic gestures, but functional operations. Actions taken to sustain the mechanisms of the universe, to ensure that the sun rose each morning, that the Nile flooded each year, that the dead were received properly by Osiris, and the living were protected by the gods. Every temple service was a working part of the machine that kept existence functioning. When Psamtik restored the temples, refilled the priesthoods, rebuilt the administrative infrastructure, and sent his daughter to Thebes to be installed as the divine adoratress of Amun, he was not performing these as acts as political maneuvers dressed in religious costume. He was performing them as genuine obligations. The political and the theological were not separate domains that a skilled ruler could play against each other. They were the same domain, seen from two different angles. Restoring Egyptian independence was the same act as restoring right order to the world. Failing to attempt the restoration, accepting foreign occupation as permanent, accommodating the fragmentation of the two lands, would have been not just political surrender, but theological failure. This may seem like an abstraction from 3,000 years away, but it is important for understanding the specific character of what Psamtik built, because it means that the cultural program of the Sais period was not a calculated artifice layered over a purely pragmatic political project. It was an integrated whole. The politics and the theology and the art and the administration were all expressions of the same underlying conviction that Egypt was a sacred order, that this order had been disrupted, and that every act of restoration, from the coronation ceremony to the episcopal stele, to the copies of Old Kingdom relief carving, to the legal contract in demotic script, was an act of divine service. This integration of the practical and the sacred is one of the things that made Egyptian civilization so durable and so distinctive. Other civilizations have separated the two, have managed the political as a secular domain, and assigned the sacred to a separate sphere. Egypt never did this, or at least never did it completely. The pharaoh was simultaneously the head of state and the chief priest, the military commander and the son of the sun god, the economic administrator and the living embodiment of cosmic principle. The coherence of Egyptian civilization across 3,000 years was, in significant measure, a consequence of this integration. A civilization whose political order was understood as a theological obligation tends to resist dissolution more stubbornly than one whose politics and theology are managed as separate departments. And it is this integration that makes the loss of the Sais period feel like more than the ordinary loss of a political dynasty. When the 26th dynasty fell, it was not just a government that fell. It was the last time, for the remaining 25 centuries of ancient Egyptian civilization's history, that Egypt would be governed on Egyptian terms by Egyptians who understood themselves as the inheritors of the full pharaonic tradition. Not subjects of a foreign empire adopting Egyptian forms, but native Egyptians who had been formed by those traditions from childhood, and who governed through them rather than around them. The Persian pharaohs were real pharaohs in the formal legal sense. They were titled, coronated, and served by Egyptian priests. But they were also the rulers of an empire whose center was in Persia, and they governed Egypt as one province among many. The Macedonian pharaohs, Alexander the Great, and the Ptolemaic dynasty that followed him were more genuinely invested in Egypt, and the Ptolemies in particular developed a sophisticated, syncretic, Egyptian-Greek cultural identity. But they were still Greek speakers, governing through an administrative system that increasingly used Greek rather than Egyptian as its primary language. And the Egypt they governed was, in cultural terms, a transformed Egypt, enriched and complicated by its integration with the Hellenistic world, but no longer fully itself in the way it had been under Psamtik. Let that sink in. The last time Egypt was fully Egypt, governed by Egyptians on Egyptian terms, within the theological framework that had sustained it for 3,000 years. That time ended in 525 BC, 18 years after Psamtik I's grandson Apries fell, and Psamtik III mounted the throne for a reign of less than a year before the Persians arrived. The world that Psamtik I had so carefully and laboriously reconstructed lasted exactly 5 generations from his death to its final destruction, and then began an uninterrupted sequence of foreign rulers that would continue until the modern era. The grief of this, and it is genuine grief, not rhetorical effect, is not for the political forms. Political forms are human inventions, contingent and changeable. The grief is for the human beings who lived within those forms, and for whom they were not contingent at all, but were the very substance of their world. The priests at Sais, who maintained the Temple of Neith for millennia, the scribes who copied the old text generation after generation, the craftsmen who studied the Old Kingdom originals and tried to reproduce their precision in the new bronzes, the farmers who understood the Nile's rhythms as a sacred gift rather than a natural phenomenon. All of these people continued after the Persian conquest. Their descendants continued after the Greek conquest and the Roman one, but something changed, slowly, over generations, in the relationship between their inner world and the outer world of the state that was supposed to embody and sustain what they knew. The Egyptian priesthood held out longer than almost anyone. The temples at Karnak and Luxor and Memphis and Dendera continued to function under Persian and Macedonian and Roman patronage for more than 1,000 years after Psamtik. The last dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Isis at Philae in 394 CE, that is, 1,000 years after the fall of the Sais dynasty, and more than 3,500 years after the beginning of pharaonic civilization. The institution endured. The priests kept chanting, the gods kept being honored, but the political context that had originally made the whole system meaningful, the living pharaoh as the embodiment of divine order, governing his own people on his own land within his own tradition, that was gone. Psamtik was, in retrospect, the last man to hold it all together, the last pharaoh in the full original sense, native-born, native-trained, genuinely sovereign, governing through the traditions he had inherited rather than around them, building them into the future with a combination of skill and devotion and patient intelligence that the evidence of his 54-year reign makes unmistakably real. He deserves to be remembered. The silence around him is a choice, and choices can be changed. There is one more thread in the deeper truth that needs to be followed to its end, because it connects the story of Psamtik to something that every person alive today has some relationship with. The knowledge systems of ancient Egypt, mathematical, medical, astronomical, agricultural, were not destroyed by the sequence of conquests that began with the Persians in 525 BC. They were transmitted, imperfectly, unevenly, with losses at every stage, but transmitted nonetheless. The Greek scholars who studied in Egypt during and after the Sais period carried what they learned back to the Aegean world. Some of it entered the Greek philosophical and scientific traditions in forms that can be traced, at least in outline, through the surviving texts. The astronomy that the Egyptian priests had been refining for millennia found its way, eventually, into the hands of Hellenistic scholars at Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander the Great on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast, which became, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, the intellectual center of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, the most ambitious attempt in antiquity to gather all existing human knowledge in one place, drew heavily on the Egyptian priestly traditions that had been systematically collecting knowledge for 3,000 years. The Library of Alexandria was itself eventually destroyed, in stages, over centuries, not in a single dramatic fire, though the dramatic fire version of the story has proven remarkably resistant to correction. Most of what it held is gone, but some of what it held was already in circulation in the wider Hellenistic world by the time the library began its long decline, and some of that survived into the medieval period in Arabic and Byzantine translations. And some of that reached Europe in the Renaissance and shaped the scientific revolution, and some of what shaped the scientific revolution is still shaping the world today. The chain from a priest at Memphis in 630 BC to a modern mathematician working in a university is not a single chain. It is a braided cable of many strands, most of them lost or frayed or impossible to trace with certainty. But it is real. The knowledge was real, the transmission was real, and the world today is different, in small but not trivial ways, because of what Egyptian civilization knew and preserved and eventually passed on. Psamtik's 54-year reign did not save all of this, but it gave it time. It gave the temple establishments 5 more generations of stability, in which to maintain their records, train their successors, and sustain the institutional conditions that made knowledge preservation possible. It gave the Greek visitors at Naucratis 2 more generations of access to Egyptian priestly knowledge in the most open and welcoming conditions it would ever experience. It made possible the specific cultural encounter between Egypt and Greece that produced, among other things, the intellectual environment in which Thales of Miletus asked the first questions that the Greek philosophical tradition would spend centuries trying to answer. None of this was guaranteed. If the third intermediate period had continued, if no Psamtik had appeared, or if a Psamtik appeared and failed, the institutional degradation of the Egyptian temple establishments would have continued. The knowledge systems they preserved would have deteriorated further. The specific encounter between Egyptian knowledge and Greek curiosity that the Sais period made possible might not have happened in the same way, at the same time, with the same consequences. We cannot know for certain what would have been different. History does not offer controlled experiments, but the conditions that Psamtik created were real, and the consequences that followed from those conditions were real, and the chain of transmission that connects the temple libraries of Sais, Egypt, to the wider history of human knowledge, however indirect and however broken, is traceable. This is why the silence around him matters, not just as an injustice to a specific historical figure, but as a gap in our understanding of how human knowledge and human civilization actually work, how they persist, how they transmit themselves across catastrophe and conquest and time, and how the decisions of individual human beings, made in specific historical moments, shape the conditions within which survival becomes possible. Psamtik made those decisions well. The world is a little different because he did, and that deserves to be said out loud. Step back far enough from any story, and the details resolve into patterns. The individual names, the specific dates, the particular choices of particular people, these compress, at sufficient distance, into something larger and less personal, the shape of a civilization's relationship with time. Egypt's relationship with time was the longest and most deliberate in the ancient world. The pharaonic tradition did not simply endure across 3,000 years. It insisted on endurance as a theological obligation, as a cosmic principle, as the primary evidence that the right order of the world was intact. The pyramids were not just tombs. They were arguments. They were the assertion, in the most permanent medium available to human hands, that what Egypt was and what Egypt meant could not be dissolved by the passage of years. Stone was the answer to time. The carving was the refusal to be forgotten. Psamtik understood this. The archaizing program of the Sais period was not nostalgia in the passive, melancholy sense of the word. It was active. It was a campaign. He sent his artists to the old monuments not to copy them as museum pieces, but to learn from them as living sources, to absorb the precision and the conviction of old kingdom craftsmanship and bring it back into the present as a functioning artistic vocabulary. He was not looking backward in defeat. He was reaching back in order to carry forward. This distinction matters for how we understand the implications of his story today. In an era when civilizations, or at least the dominant academic and popular cultures, tend to associate progress with discontinuity, with the rejection of old forms in favor of new ones, the Sais period is a reminder that continuity can be a form of strength rather than stagnation, that recovering the past, carefully, critically, with genuine knowledge of what you are recovering and why, is not the same as being unable to move forward, that a civilization that knows where it came from has a resource available to it that a civilization unmoored from its own history does not. But the implications cut in more than one direction, and intellectual honesty requires following them to uncomfortable places. The civilization that Psamtik restored, however genuinely and skillfully, was restored in a world that was changing faster than any restoration could fully accommodate. The 7th and 6th centuries BC were a period of accelerating transformation across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. The expansion of Greek colonization, the rise and fall of the Assyrian Empire, the emergence of the Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires, the development of coinage as a technology of exchange, the early stirrings of what would become the Greek philosophical revolution. The pace of change in the human world around Egypt in the century of the Sais dynasty's existence was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkable. Egypt participated in this change. The Sais period was not isolated from it. Naucratis was itself a form of participation, an institutionalized engagement with the Greek world that brought Egyptian civilization into contact with the most intellectually dynamic culture in the Mediterranean basin at precisely the moment when that culture was undergoing its most formative transformation. The Egypt that Herodotus visited was not a sealed monument. It was a living civilization, deeply rooted in its own traditions and simultaneously open to the world around it. But there is something sobering in the observation that the very openness that enriched the Sais period also made the eventual transition to Persian rule smoother than it might otherwise have been. A civilization that has spent a century engaging with the wider world, that has welcomed foreign merchants and soldiers and intellectuals within its borders, that has developed the administrative and institutional flexibility to manage cosmopolitan communities. This civilization is, by definition, less resistant to absorption into a cosmopolitan empire than one that has maintained rigid closure. Psamtik's openness was a genuine virtue and a genuine strength. It was also, in the long run, a factor that made the dissolution of Egyptian political independence less traumatic and less culturally catastrophic than it might have been, and therefore, perhaps, less likely to inspire the kind of determined, sustained resistance that might have prolonged it. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about the nature of civilizational choices. Every choice that makes a civilization more flexible also makes it more absorbable. Every choice that makes it more resistant also makes it more brittle. There is no position outside this tension. Psamtik chose the side of flexibility and engagement, and the consequences of that choice, both the wonderful ones in the cultural richness of the Sais period and the sobering ones in the relatively smooth transition to Persian rule, were all genuinely his. What our place on this planet, beneath the accumulated weight of all the civilizations that have risen and dissolved since the first cities appeared along the river valleys of the ancient world, suggests is something that the Sais period embodies with unusual clarity. We are not the first people to stand at the edge of disruption and try to determine what is worth preserving, what is worth adapting, and what must be let go. The farmers along the Nile in the 21st century of the modern era are the biological and cultural descendants, in various complicated and intermixed ways, of the people who stood in Psamtik's Egypt. The temples at Karnak and Luxor that tourists visit are the same temples that Psamtik's artists studied and restored. The hieroglyphic inscriptions on those temple walls, still visible, still readable to trained Egyptologists, still embodying the theological arguments that the Egyptian civilization made across 3,000 years, are the writing of a people whose descendants have never entirely left. This continuity is real and it is remarkable. It is also partial and complicated by everything that happened between the fall of the Sais dynasty and the present moment. The modern Egyptian relationship to the ancient world is one of the most complex questions in the contemporary archaeology and cultural politics of the region, and it deserves more careful attention than it typically receives. The people of Egypt today are not the same as the people of Site Egypt. They are also not entirely different. The thread is tangled and hard to follow, but it has not been completely cut. The opening of this script described the Egypt that Psamtik inherited, a country that looked like Egypt, smelled like Egypt, was spoken of as Egypt by people who had been born there and whose families had been born there for generations, but that was effectively governed by a foreign power that had no deep connection to what Egypt meant at its core. This description was chosen deliberately because it describes a situation that is not unique to the 7th century BC. The experience of being the nominal inheritor of a tradition that has been disrupted by forces beyond one's control, and of having to determine what it means to restore that tradition without either falsifying the disruption or surrendering to it. This experience belongs to no single people and no single era. What Psamtik did with that experience was extraordinary. He neither pretended the disruption had not happened nor accepted it as permanent. He worked within it, around it, through it, using every tool available, ancient and new, native and foreign, theological and practical, toward the recovery of something genuinely worth recovering. And he succeeded. Impermanently, as all human achievements are impermanent, but genuinely. The reflection that this invites is not a political prescription. The past does not supply operating instructions for the present, but it does supply evidence that recovery is possible, that civilizations which have been fragmented and occupied and disrupted can be restored, and that the people who accomplish that restoration do so through the same combination of patience, pragmatism, rootedness, and openness that Psamtik demonstrated. The conditions are not unique to Egypt. They are, in their general form, available anywhere to anyone who has the clarity to identify what is genuinely worth preserving, and the intelligence to pursue it without the hubris that imagines permanence is achievable. Nothing is permanent. The stone Abu Simbel is patient, but even stone wears down. What endures, if anything endures in the carrying of it forward, in the deliberate choice to remember, to transmit, to refuse the convenience of forgetting. Psamtik refused. His priests maintained the list. His artists studied the originals. His scribes wrote the contracts. And 2,500 years later, in a medium he could not have imagined, his name is being spoken again. That, too, is a form of restoration. There is a particular quality to the evidence of the Site period that keeps pulling the mind back to the question of what we owe to the past. Not sentimentally, but practically. The demotic papyri, the bronze figures, the apis bull stelae, the Greek names scratched into sandstone at Abu Simbel, the legal contract in the Louvre. These are the material residue of a civilization that took seriously the obligation to maintain what it had inherited and to transmit what it knew. They are also, most of them, unknown to the general public. Objects in middle galleries, footnotes in academic papers, entries in specialist databases that no one outside a narrow scholarly community ever consults. The work of making these objects known, of moving Psamtik and his dynasty from the footnote to the chapter, is itself a form of the work that the Site priests and scribes were doing 3,000 years ago. It is the work of refusal, the refusal to let the silence stand unchallenged, the refusal to accept that the narrative convention of inevitable Egyptian decline is adequate to the reality it claims to describe, the refusal to treat the absence of popular attention as evidence of actual unimportance. The planet has buried civilizations before. It will do so again. The ground beneath every major city on Earth contains the remains of earlier ways of human life, earlier building traditions, earlier languages, earlier systems of meaning, most of them unknown to the people living above them. The Nile Delta, where Psamtik built his restoration, is particularly deep in this sense. Layers of civilization so dense and so ancient that the archaeological work of excavating them will require generations of effort that has barely begun. What is already known, what the surviving inscriptions and papyri and bronze figures and apistelae and Greek pottery have revealed to the scholars who have devoted their careers to this period is extraordinary. What remains unknown is almost certainly more extraordinary still. The city of Sais, ancient capital of Egypt during the 26th dynasty, home of the great temple of Neith, where Psamtik was almost certainly crowned, and where his dynasty maintained its most important religious center for 138 years, lies beneath the modern Egyptian town of Sais el-Hagar. The archaeological potential of that site is, by the assessment of specialists who have studied it, enormous. The physical remains of the site royal capital, the temples, the palaces, the administrative buildings, the royal tombs, may be preserved beneath the silt in a state of remarkable completeness. The standard conditions for preservation in Egyptian archaeological sites, dry conditions, stable sand and silt overburden, limited disturbance, are partially present. The difficulty is simply that there are people living there, as they have been living there, in various forms, for 4,000 years. This is not a problem to be solved by archaeology alone. It is a question about how a living community relates to what lies beneath its feet, about the relationship between the present and the past, in a place where that relationship is quite literally structural. The houses of Sais el-Hagar are built on the ruins of Sais. The choice of whether and how to engage with those ruins is not primarily a scholarly choice. It is a human one, made by the people who live there and the institutions that govern them. What the archaeology of the Site period has already demonstrated, even with the limitations imposed by inaccessible delta sites and fragmentary evidence, is that the story it has to tell is worth the effort of telling. Psamtik I is not a minor figure in a marginal era. He is one of the more consequential political leaders of the ancient world, a man who achieved something that was not supposed to be achievable, who built something that lasted longer than it had any right to, and who left behind a cultural legacy that has been influencing the wider world, in ways mostly invisible to those who inherited it, ever since. The silence that has surrounded him is a kind of forgetting. And forgetting, the Site period reminds us, is always a choice, made not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated small decisions of narrators, curators, teachers, and writers who chose, again and again, to look past what was there and focus on what they expected to find. The expectation can be changed. The looking can begin again. That is where we find ourselves, at the end of this long examination of a man who restored a civilization from the ruins of occupation and fragmentation, standing at the edge of the field where Sais lies buried, deciding whether to notice what is there. He would have understood the decision. He spent his entire reign making it. Somewhere beneath the delta soil of modern Egypt, in the place that was once called Sais, there is a city waiting to be found. Not waiting in any active sense. The city does not know it is waiting, any more than the Nile knows it is ancient, but it is there. The streets that Psamtik walked, the temple precincts, where his priests performed the rituals that he believed sustained the order of the universe, the administrative buildings, where the scribes kept the records of a restored kingdom, the royal tombs, where the pharaohs of the 26th dynasty were buried with the full ceremonial weight of 3,000 years of tradition behind them. All of this lies beneath the surface of a landscape that modern life occupies without knowing what it stands on. This is the condition of the ancient world everywhere. The ground is deep, the layers are old. The history of human civilization on this planet is so much longer and more complex than the portion of it that has been excavated and understood that the known is, in a very real sense, a small island surrounded by an ocean of the unknown. We stand on what earlier people built, and they stood on what earlier people built before them, and the depth of what lies beneath is almost never commensurate with the confidence of our accounts. Psamtik I, or Hebrew Psamtik, Lord of the Two Lands, living Horus, son of Ra, died in 610 BC after a reign of 54 years. He had come to power as a vassal of the empire that occupied his country. He left it as the independent pharaoh of a restored Egypt, the founder of a dynasty that would last another 138 years. The man who had held Greek mercenaries and ancient temple priests and Libyan delta lords and Theban priestesses in a single, functioning, genuinely Egyptian state through a combination of strategic patience, cultural intelligence, and something that can only be called a profound sustained commitment to the idea that what Egypt was worth recovering. He had no way of knowing that the dynasty he founded would be the last one, that the independence he restored would last only 5 more generations before the Persians arrived, and the sequence of foreign rule began that would not genuinely end until the modern era. He did not build the Seti period with the knowledge of its ending. He built it with the conviction that it could last, that the foundations were sound, that the restored mat of a reunified Egypt was something that could sustain itself indefinitely if the right conditions were maintained. This is the condition of all human building. We do not build knowing that what we build will end. We build as if it could last. The pyramids were built as if they could last forever. The site archaizing program was carried out as if the tradition it was invoking could be perpetuated indefinitely. The priests at Philae were still carving hieroglyphs in 394 CE, as if the tradition would continue after them. The tradition did not continue after them, but the carving was not wasted. The act of maintaining the form, of keeping the signs alive, of performing the ritual, of writing the name, carries its own meaning independent of whether the thing maintained will survive. The performance of continuity is not the same as the fact of continuity, but it is not nothing. This is not a comfortable thought. It is, however, an honest one. The title question that opened this account was, who was Psamtik I and why does he matter? The answer to the first part is now as clear as the evidence allows. He was the pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, who reunified Egypt after nearly a century of Assyrian dominance and internal fragmentation, who founded the Sais cultural renaissance, who established the conditions for 138 years of restored Egyptian independence, who opened the country to the Greek world in ways that shaped the subsequent history of Mediterranean civilization, and who demonstrated across a 54-year reign a quality of political and cultural intelligence that few leaders in any era have matched. The answer to the second part, why he matters, is both simpler and more demanding. He matters because the story of what he accomplished is a true account of what human beings are capable of when they combine patience with intelligence, pragmatism with rootedness, and genuine commitment to the value of what they are trying to preserve. He matters because the silence that has surrounded him is itself a lesson about how civilizational memory works and what happens when narrative convention obscures genuine achievement. He matters because the present moment, wherever and whenever it happens to be, is always standing in the position that Psamtik stood in, inheriting disruption, managing fragmentation, deciding what is worth the effort of recovery. And he matters because the Egyptian priests, who maintained the list of pharaoh names, generation after generation, through occupation and conquest, and the slow transformation of everything they had known, were right to include him on it. The list is an argument against forgetting. It is the insistence that what happened was real, that the people who lived through it were real, and that the refusal to remember them is not neutrality, but a choice with consequences. Think about what it means to look at the ground you are standing on and understand, even partly, what lies beneath it. Most of the time we do not have this option. The layers are too deep, the evidence too fragmentary, the distance between the present and the relevant past too vast for ordinary awareness to bridge. But occasionally, when the right evidence survives, when the right scholars devote themselves to its study, when the knowledge they produce reaches the people who might carry it forward, the distance contracts. The ground becomes transparent, briefly and imperfectly. The people who built what lies beneath it become for a moment almost present. This is what the story of Psamtik I offers, and it is not a small thing. A young man standing in the delta of the 7th century BC, managing the aftermath of an occupation that had taken his father's life and taken him into exile, choosing to work patiently within the constraints he faced rather than break himself against them, choosing to build from the oldest available foundations rather than improvise something new, choosing to use what was available: Greek soldiers, Lydian alliances, ancient priestly traditions, the theological legitimacy of a restored pharaonic ceremony, in service of something that most observers would have considered impossible: the recovery of a civilization. He spent 54 years at the work. He did not finish it. No one finishes a civilization. You carry it as far as you can and hand it to the next generation, and hope that the next generation understands what they have been given. His son Necho II understood. His grandson Apries understood, in his complicated way. His successor Ahmose II understood well enough to preside over the longest, most commercially successful reign of the Sais period. They carried it. All the way to the edge of the world they knew, and then the Persians arrived and the world changed. But the priests kept the list, and the list kept the name, and 2,500 years later, the name is still recoverable, still legible, still capable of meaning something to anyone willing to look. There is a bronze cat in the British Museum, Sais period, approximately 600 to 500 BC. The hands that shaped it knew the hands that had shaped the tradition that taught them. The tradition ran backward, in an unbroken line of transmission, for 2,000 years before they touched it. They added their work to the line, and now the line extends forward, through the Persian occupation, and the Greek conquest, and the Roman administration, and the Christian transformation, and the Arab conquest, and everything that has happened since, to the glass case in a museum in London, where the bronze cat sits with its unhurried expression, absolutely indifferent to the question of whether the people walking past it know what it took to make it. It is perfectly proportioned. Its surface is the deep, rich green black of ancient bronze. Its expression, if expression is the right word for the face of a cast metal figure, is one of absolute unhurried authority. It looks like nothing that can be hurried. It looks like something that has already outlasted everything that seemed more important. The civilization that made it once had a man who held it together long enough for it to be made. His name was Psamtik, and now you know it.